All right, I'm going to start. We've got, slow arrivals. We've been talking about what to do next, and didn't start the recording. We were talking about what to do next, but we're finishing up. We're supposed to be finishing up contributions to philosophy for the event this time. Last section of part 8. Because of attendance, we might actually try to have another discussion about that, but we'll see. Anyway, closing out contributions is what we're planning on doing this time. For next time, the Essence of Truth essay from this or Pathmarks. It's about 25 pages. We'd be doing that for a single session. I was asking people if they could do December 22nd for that. That would be 4 weeks from today. Does that work for people? Yes, for Pete.
Yeah, it works for me.
Okay. Ella, any difficulties with the 22nd of December? Oh, it's still on mute. We'll assume not. And then the idea was that sometime in the new year, we would start in on basic questions of philosophy, which is contemporaneous with contributions. It's a lecture course he did, I think, in 38. But as some of the similar ground of essence of truth questions, and then especially a long discussion of wonder as the basic disposition of philosophy in the first beginning, and then contrasting that a little bit of contrasting that with his own, where his own stuff is headed in another beginning. But there's a lot of it which is about just the truth is aletheia, essence of truth to the Greeks, relating some of that to Aristotle, but also basic dispositions, basic disposition of wonder, and so on. Anyway, so that's what that one is about. And some people recommend it as an introduction to the contributions, but I think it's also much more digestible if you've tried to wrestle with contributions than if you've never seen any of that subject matter. It's probably also useful if you've done the Essence of Truth stuff. So anyway, we're gonna do the Essence of Truth essay as a standalone in December, and then we'll potentially start in on basic questions of philosophy in January. I am, willing to get input from people on other things I might want to do. There's lots of things we've talked about, but I think this is sort of the most proximate, natural thing to do next. All right, so that's just next things. In our ordinary course of things, we'd be doing round robins of this, and then there's various things I want to go through about it, about the reading itself. There's the early sections of the reading that are on the ontological difference, meaning of being with a Y, meaning of the event, very direct exposition of all those things as opposed to contrasting it with the other things around it. So that's in a way why one of the reasons I wanted this to be its own session is to hive off that direct discussion of what he means by being with Y, what he means by event. I think there's like 15 different single statements of what being means with a Y in this part of the reading. And then there's some things on Dasein and human being, some things on history and historiography, on language, those sorts of things towards the end of the book and closing it out. And then we might also talk about overall impressions of the book at the end of all that. So anyway, that's the general outline of the stuff I see to discuss, but want to get everybody else's impressions from the reading to the extent they manage to do it, and things they want talked about. Pete, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. I managed to do the reading, actually went back over parts of it. I think now I have a fairly good understanding of the book as a whole. And I also think it's not a book that has a, beginning, middle, and concluding end. Somewhere he describes the parts as fugues, and that makes sense. When you reach the end, you can go back to the beginning, start over, and it works in that sense. I kind of when I was going through it a second time, I found one phrase that I thought really summed it up for me of what's going on. and it's at the bottom of page 382, the end of the penultimate paragraph, where he says, being, or with a Y, beyng, as event grounds the temporal spatial playing field for that which is true. And I think that's as good a summary as the book as you can get. And I see the baying as the clearing and the playing field as the world from being in time as the field of meaningfulness for Dasein. And it's the clearing, the events in the clearing are the structure behind the world of meaningfulness, where things are true for Dasein.
So I'm going to partly, I mean, I think largely that's right in terms of the being naming the between or the open in which the confrontations happen, but by his explicit intention, the strife between world and earth is part of that open, and that means the earth is included, and that means it's not just the field of meaning, it's also the submerged aspects of things. The world of meaning is only half of the environment of that open, and it's also, for Dasein, is only half of the confronting personalities in that open, which is gods and men to him, gods and men and earth and world, right? And so, but he wouldn't want all of this to be just about the Dasein world piece.
Right, he's got a lot to flesh out there.
Yes,
But
that's you're
but
not
I
wrong
like
about the
that
open.
phrase.
You're not wrong about the open, right? The other thing that I noticed about that phrase, though, is that the very beginning of it, he calls it the transmission of the stroke of being itself. And I think it's worth trying to understand why he says that. Because there's a notion in this, which is, it is the appropriating event, the appropriating aspect of the event is something like something coming from truth, something coming from being itself is instantiated, activated, made real, realized, resolved possibility, decided in Dasein, but Dasein is a through sounding board of that, not the initiator of that. And that comes out towards at the very end of the book. He's definitely trying to sharply distinguish this from anything like this is a creative act of Nietzschean will to, legislate the future content of world or something like that. Anyway, but yes, sorry, other thoughts on the part of the reading?
No, that's it for me for intro.
Okay, are there any things in here that you wanted to make sure that we covered, explained, that aren't? I know you've been over this stuff many times, so these things are relatively clear to you, but
yeah, I wrote a note on 399. He mentions the time of being.
oh yes, you want us to cover that?
Yeah, I thought I didn't quite get that one. I'll have to look at it again.
Yeah, we'll definitely go over that whole section. That section is meant to be a kind of culminating section, and I mean, it also raises the question of why is he bringing up gods in any of this? But the immediately preceding part is, for the first time, this question, what then is impossible. And then the moment of the event of appropriation is the event. This moment is the time of being. So I think that this is, we'll talk about what that means, but it relates to this issue of something like an incalculable, free, appropriating truth being in charge of this development. the time of being is the time where what shall be is being determined by being itself. The contrast would be as opposed to the time of metaphysics or the time of man. But we can come back to other meanings of that. But I agree that it is a striking formulation, and it is very much trying to be a culmination of what's being said in the second half of the book. I think the last section is even more so, but we can get to that. But yes, we should focus on trying to explain what he means by the time of being after we've gotten through all this stuff about what he means by being with a Y and an event. Okay, so see, Jason managed to join us. That's great. So Ella, I know you didn't get through all the reading, but do you have first impressions or things you want to make sure that we cover, or shall we just?
No, I have a general question, but I can wait to see if you guys go over it. So
You can ask your general question. It can't hurt.
okay. At times it sounds like very general, that Heidegger is sort of in line with Hegelian thinking, dialectical thinking, in that he thinks that, historically things are going to arise, events will arise, and there will be in power, and from these events, and then there will be a negation that will occur,
Mhm.
and then a synthesis over time. But he almost seems, I'm wondering what the source of his, if there's an event that rises that is incredibly powerful, it seems like he has a resignation toward it. Or is that incorrect? Is it that he's postulating some sort of standing in truth, being genuine? What do you do in the face of the power? Or you just kind of have to wait historically for it to be negated, for there to be a synthesis, a negation and a synthesis of that power in history over time?
So these are great questions. I mean, so it's fair to say that there is some significant indebtedness to Hegel, and if I can put it this way, tropes out of Hegel or moves out of Hegel in Heidegger, or in Heidegger as just standing in the whole tradition of German idealism. But he is definitely consciously differing sharply from Hegel on other points in all this. And he's a sharp critic of Hegel's tendency to make all of those aspects of dialectic into something which can be reduced to a rational system with a foreseeable end. He is insisting upon an indeterminate openness in anything like that process. It's not even that process, but his own version of it, that defies calculation. He says several points in here that being is what defies system and calculation, being with a Y. So you're right to point out that there are times when he seems to be saying the history of philosophy has to go here. It has to learn this thing from Hölderlin to take the next step along its way, and that way therefore seems to be laid out as clear to him. But he doesn't think all of that is systematic rational calculation in the way that Hegel does. He also doesn't think that it is something like a collective human consciousness that is involved in that. To be fair to Hegel, he thinks of that collective consciousness as being human, but also more than human. It's a correspondence between human and absolute mind, something like that in Hegel. But to Heidegger, Hegel is someone who has made the human world into the whole. He has made an interior, subjectivized view of the assimilated content of the world into he's pushed that to the horizon of existence, and from Heidegger's point of view, that is an attempt to colonize and assimilate everything that is, and that is a closing off of openness to being itself and to event itself. It is a Heidegger is anti-system in this regard. He is here constructing his own, phase of something. It can look like a step in a Hegelian dialectic. I can agree with that. But he wants it precisely as an open, indeterminate structure that is based upon how thinkers now and the future respond to whatever being sends, if that's the way of putting it. So there's a complex relationship between what he is doing and what Hegel is doing, and he is a sharp critic of pieces of it, but may be indebted to him more than he lets on at times. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, and it's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Josh?
I always appreciate when, and especially in this book, when Heidegger, for me, reinforces earlier thinking of his. He may enrich it here, but specifically with regard to the difference between history and historicity. And I know that he here and other places around this time was sort of regretting a little bit ways in which in being in time, he wasn't able to avoid a certain historicizing himself. But at any rate, that distinction to me is important because I like any aspect of his work that gives an opportunity to kind of focus on issues that I find tend to be controversial among Heidegger scholars, and I find a lot of tendencies among many of them to precisely historicize. And the other issue is language. And in the same way, language is such a crucial issue for Heidegger and for a number of other scholars who recognized or rethought their relation to language and the relation between language and thought, relation between language and between language and the world. All these issues that really get to the heart of assumptions about language. For example, that understand language in terms of symbol and symbol systems, semiological structures, various structuralisms, that kind of a thing. So I really, I'm looking forward to sort of concentrating a little bit on what would still be controversial for a lot of people, or confusing for a lot of people.
No, those are great issues raised. I mean, and these are things which he gets to after he goes through meaning of being and an event in the sort of straight exposition of his own position sections here. But the things which he immediately turns to are things like the history and historiography, which is extremely critical of historiography, and have what if I can put it this way, conventional historicism, something like that. And you're right that there are plenty of people who read him that way, or who liked his history of philosophy stuff precisely because they could use it to construct a kind of philosophy of history in a historicist way. And he is sharply critical of that here as being not actually open to anything like disruptive truth, if we can put it something like that. And you're also right that he brings up here toward the end all these questions in the direction of language and some of his later stuff. But I think it's fair to say here, you only get the connecting tissue of why that problematic comes up and why he's going to later have to go, write things on the way to language. He doesn't actually give you that analysis here of why there's something about language as the house of being, which is different from treating language as a symbol, something like that. He sketches out why he would need a research program to flesh all that out, to recapitulate understanding of language in a way which is compatible with the changes he's made here to understanding of being, and trying to avoid some of the, put it this way, the traps of metaphysical thinking and conventional understanding of language. And it's fair to say that both at his time and afterwards, there was enough bubbling ferment in other schools of philosophy around that issue that lots of people wanted to use their understanding of their own separate understanding of language as a means to come to grips with and understand what Heidegger was talking about in a way that Heidegger would consider missing his point or deliberately avoiding his point, or trying to, reducing to something predictable from another explanatory system, something like that. Place him in a discursive formation, something like that. But he here doesn't manage to flesh out all the ways in which he would have an issue with that. He points to them. He raises the questions that on the meaning of language that are raised by this changed understanding of being, but he doesn't answer them yet. And I consider that it's sort of an unfinished pointer over towards on the way to language and some of his other later work on the subject. There's not enough here on what he thinks about language to make a full theory or explanation to contrast with the competing theories. You can just notice that he sees the problem, raises it, and is not going to just acquiesce in being semiotically pigeonholed that way, right? So I don't know if that gets at the stuff you're talking about or what's remains controversial. I don't think what he says about language here can resolve those things for us. It just shows that it's a live issue. Is that fair?
I think he does more than that, but unless we have the background, we don't see it in the few lines that he's writing here. If we're relying just on what he says here, we don't have anything to go on. I agree with you. But I think that what the little he does say already has embedded within it, decades of thinking on language.
Oh, I agree with that. I positively agree with that. I also would say that the stuff he says on historiography here is way more definitive, way more final. It doesn't need an extra book to explain what he means about that. But I do think that to give a full explication of what he means by being using language to say itself, and the way that human being and language are both primarily related to being, something like that. You're right that what he sketches out there has a lot behind it. It's not a superficial thought on his part, but it's also not it's not elaborated enough to handle all the objectors, something like that. But I think our assessment is similar.
To be honest, that even in his later work over the course of his career, I felt that language is one area in which you don't, or in my opinion, you don't get a level of sort of detail or density of argumentation that is that you can compare to some other aspects of his thinking. Because I remember, being so interested in it and searching through every bit of his writing where he's dealing with language and saying, okay, now in this book we'll finally get to the heart of things, and it was always still a little bit ambiguous for me. So that was just my impression about how he treated language.
Yeah, that's probably fair. All right, fine questions, and I definitely want to make sure we go through the historiography and his critique of historiography. He talks about, whether or not it is possible to destroy historiography, but that's not going to be up to us, and we have to talk about what he means by that, and the contrast between that and history. All right, Jason. My namesake.
Oh, I've been busy this week, so I haven't been keeping up with the reading, so everything's new to me.
Okay. are there things you want to make sure that we cover, or is it just gonna listen and kibitz?
Well, I can listen and see what's going on, and then maybe I'll have something to say about the term or whatever that I want to, better example about or something.
Okay, fair enough. All right. So we got through first reactions. We should get to some of the exposition things now. So among the things that were raised, we definitely want to talk about the time of being, history, historiography. Those are things that people mentioned. But I want to start with the ontological difference. It was the beginning of our reading. For those familiar with being in time, it's something made much of in being in time. It was also a kind of point where, put it this way, Heidegger clearly had a case from the standpoint of other philosophical schools, something like that. And you can read this section on the being in the ontological difference. This is section 266, as being in part trying to explain how what he managed to say in being in time wasn't the whole story here, but also wasn't fully heard because people read it in a particular direction and didn't get all of the point, something like that. But the basic point here, I don't know, basic point. One basic point here is to try to explain to readers of being in time that the ontological difference is not the primary or essential way to think about being with a Y. He's about to give you his explanation of being with a Y, what he means by it, in positive terms, in his own terms, and he needs to clear the ground from the possible expectation that he's just going to be recapitulating something he said about in being in time about the ontological difference, and that's just going to be that again, right? Because it's not that. Being with Y, seyn with Y is different. Okay, but first, what is the ontological difference as explicated in being in time and mentioned here? It's the difference between being and beings, fundamentally, and being as something which beings have, as opposed to the being that is had, is the way that that is presented in being in time, with the underlying point being that there has to be some prior understanding of being, even in order to experience and categorize things as being. This is part of saying Dasein is the being that understands being in the being in time analysis. I mean, so there's a priority issue here of which is the underlying experience and structure, and the strong claim there is that there has to be some understanding of what being itself means in order for the beings to appear as beings. You cannot derive what being means from looking at the beings and factoring them according to something they have in common. Right, and he then characterizes here metaphysics is specifically that way of thinking about being that starts from beings and immediately returns to beings. It only goes to being as something which the beings have in common, and then it will also think of being in general and that being in common as a highest being or a highest form of being or highest meaning of being, highest idea of being, if you like, to be Platonic about it, or being in an unrestricted sense, being absolutely, and that in the scholastic Middle Ages and maybe even before is also equated with the highest being as God, right? So you get the ontotheology side of all this. What's the point of this? The point of this is that understanding the beings, understanding being only in contrast to the beings, from the beings and back to the beings, is what he is characterizing here as the way of metaphysics, and he is pointing away from that towards, if I go this way, a more phenomenological approach of the direct experienced intuition of being itself as the occurrence that it is, that is the basis of the projections that are used in all of that. And in the whole previous sections on Dasein, the claim was effectively made that those are accessible. We've made the claims that there is something like an intuitive accessibility of the meaning of being as something event-like, undergone, appropriated, enthroned, etc. All of that stuff we got in the structure of Dasein and being in time is now here part of the structure of being itself with the Y as the event. Okay. So the first question is just, is the contrast between the way in which being is arrived at by metaphysics and the way he is trying to arrive at being by sort of direct intellectual intuition / inspection of it as an occurrence that Dasein undergoes, is that clear? Is it clear why these would be contrasting approaches, even at the ontological difference level? Ella?
I have a, yeah, I have a hunch. I think it might be because he wants to separate being with a Y from the history of metaphysics, to delineate it from that history.
It's partly that, but it's partly a claim that the thing which is accomplished in the history of metaphysics is the disappearing of being. And he's going to claim that effectively this is the result of that, not just starting point, but consistent fact about its history. Because metaphysics tries to think about being from the standpoint of starting with the beings and returning to what it means for the beings, because it is asking the question, what are the beings always? That's its question. In that frame, being itself is going to be judged by the standards of beingness of the beings, which it will not have, and therefore it will disappear. To put it bluntly, if being is not a concrete material particular, and if only concrete material particulars have existence in some, updated Aristotelian or empiricist or positivist worldview, therefore it does not exist. If it doesn't have thinkable attributes, a Cartesian will recognize it as existing. And the overall disenchanting of the world that the whole book is kind of about, the disappearing of any question of gods, but also the disappearing of the questions of anything like the meaning of being, is, from Heidegger's point of view, a long begging of the question, or baked into the procedure of the conclusion, which is that you're only going to judge what being can mean from the beings. And that means you never look at it directly. You only look at it as it appears in the beings, and the result is everything which is actually distinctive about it is going to disappear. One way of putting this is, if I'm looking for something which is an actual unfolding unique event in time, and I only look for it in its ideal class character, I will miss it, because that's exactly what it doesn't have. When you go from being to the beings, from the one to the many in that respect, you're also going to the conceptual, abstracted, ideal-like class. And if that is exactly the character that being as event doesn't have, then you are going to miss it. Your selection criteria of looking for ideal-like things, ideal-like patterns that are true across all of the beings, is going to only ever discover ideal-likeness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like, well, it reminds me of Plato. So, but when you said from the one to the many, because you're going from the one to many.
Well, you could understand the being that the beings have by first I experience what being is. I have a full understanding of what being is. I have a full experience of what being is. And with that full understanding of it, I notice what is like that in the beings, right? That would be a procedure where I'm first completely grounded in a direct experience of being. And then that provides almost template-like information about what is being like about the beings. But if I don't have that first experience, and if I start instead from what all the beings have in common, I will be looking for a common across them. And the thing that I will find in common across them will always be common, ideal-like, class-like. It will never be unique, because class-like and unique contradict each other. It will never be ongoing event, because it will always be abstract, because it's an ideal-like thing. Just by moving from the frame of the individual original experience of event to the beings, I've already determined that I can only ever find something that is, from Heidegger's point of view, an abstraction.
Okay.
I can put this slightly in terms of put it in terms of a slightly different controversy among analytic philosophers, right? Do you understand? You can try to define what a set is by just giving me the list of all the things that to which it applies. I just list all the things that are in it, and that is the definition of the set. I give you an extension definition of it, as opposed to I give it a function or form that the members of it satisfy. In the latter case, I have a criteria, and that's more like an actual essence, carving out a meaning, something like that. Whereas if I just give you the list of the things to which it apply, I'm expecting you to see whatever they have in common. And if I make a collection that doesn't have anything common, or if I make a collection which isn't even a set because it has duplicates in it that are hidden behind a formula or something, then you're not going to understand what this thing is. You're trying to understand it only from its extension. And the result is you can't even verify whether or not the things in that extension are a set or merely a collection, etc. I'm just trying to frame a similar problem from a different field, from analytic philosophy, but it's not like other people haven't noticed this problem. He is objecting to defining beingness with an extension definition that just lists off a bunch of beings and then expects you to see what is common in them, when the only thing you're going to see is commonness and therefore idea-likeness. And all the things that are distinctive to being as event that he is trying to stress here will be missed in that process. And that's why he's stressing them. He's stressing them because they are precisely the things about event-like truthfulness that a conceptual representational frame cannot see.
Thank you.
So a couple of comments. One, I think this is similar to something in Aristotle's Metaphysics, where he talks about the origin of things. And he says, well, you can go by genus and say, oh, it's a dog, oh, it's a mammal, it's an animal, it's a being, but that's just a genus and really doesn't get to the origin. And to me, I also relate it to Kant, where what Heidegger is asking for is, what's the condition for the possibility for there to be beings? You're not going to get at it by studying beings. It's something else. It's not the being of beings. It's the condition for there to be being.
Sure. I mean, the reason I'm hesitating a little bit is there are other places here where he's trying to explain that being as he means it cannot be understood as a condition for the beings, and if it is, that it is degraded, something like that. That's why I'm resisting that formulation. But you're right that in Kant this same issue arises. But the way I would put it is, in Kant, when you're talking about the, when you're talking about the understanding, he assumes that you have a thing, you have an object, right? And the things which you get from that are not just the logical or essence machinery, so to speak, that he's mostly investigating, but he's assuming you also have, if you can put it this way, an empirical given, right?
Yeah, so Kant assumes there's a spatial temporal place in which being appears, and that's not what Heidegger is going after.
Sure, but I'm not just getting the difference in the schemata. I'm just saying that Kant takes for granted the thing which Heidegger would point at as the existence thing. If you ask Kant what he means by existence, he means it's a judgment as to its level of necessity, of it's not completely necessary by logic and it's not merely possible by logic, but it just happens to be true, right? But where does that happens to be true come from? And the answer for Kant is it's just an empirical given. It's the placing of the thing in absolute position because there's some prior experiential givenness of it. But that prior experiential givenness of it is exactly what doesn't fit in the logical machinery, right? It's unique. It's an outside. It's not part of the machinery. It's not an a priori judgment at all. And because he's looking only at what is known a priori, he's abstracting from that, right? Because it's only pure reason he's looking at, not empirical reason, something like that. But Heidegger is interested especially in what is added by the fact that reason is never pure, right? Every mind that has ever actually existed has been an embodied mind with empirical all around it in time and all the rest of it, right? So from Heidegger's point of view, disembodied minds do not exist, right? They're all saturated with being and made by it and plugged into it, right? So, and that's even at the level of the being and time thing. The point that I'm getting at here, though, is that it's easy to overlook how much you are biasing what you can find by the fact that you are looking for it as a many with a class character, right? The very fact that the thing you're looking for is a many with a class character means you will not find ones, you will not find uniqueness, you will not find actualities. You also won't find concrete possibilities even. You will only find possibilities of something in a logical space, so it could be this way or it could be that way, which is not what possible means when it's subject to an empirical decision, right? Anyway, those are just some of the things he's going to get to a little bit later, but I'm laying all this out because when he explains in 267 what he means by event, he's going to give a list of 8 different things that event itself actually has as character. And the point is to notice how these things, although he's still describing a structure and he's still describing something which is true across events, it's still not the abstract beingness meant to apply to anything which is a being of the metaphysical understanding of it, right? And these things are appropriation, decision, encounter, unsettling, withdrawal, simplicity, uniqueness, and solitude. And he's saying that every event is as event in its actual event-like character and its actual empirical truthiness, not abstract, possible truthiness, is characterized by those things, right? It is. Go ahead.
You threw in the word empirical truthiness. Do you want to use empirical?
Yeah, I'm only using empirical to contrast it with logical, and you're right that empirical is not the right term here. This is what he's getting at with appropriation, right? Appropriation decision, because the first point of appropriation is that it is a thrown, grasped directedness of the mind to the meaning, something like that. That's what the appropriation is getting at. Although he's also relating it here to the between Dasein and gods, because he is also tying this to event in his highest sense, not just event in the trivial sense. Sorry.
Not to nitpick, but should we maybe get rid of the concept of mind also? Is that really
You're right that this is you're right that this is not something which he's trying to explain a neo-Kantian theory of mind. This is meant to be about being as it actually occurs, right? And being as it actually occurs is not a mental event, right? But for people who aren't steeped in Heidegger, the notion of appropriation is very hard for them to see if they haven't already noticed the fact that Dasein is a kind of being whose being is subject to a kind of resolving decision in possibilities that are in a thrown in deciding manner going in a particular place. The being of Dasein is continually being decided upon and revised. And the easiest way that people have from traditional schools of thought for thinking about that is to just go back to Descartes and what he tells you. If you're a thought thinking thing, that the content of thoughts are mostly what you are. And Heidegger is not saying that you're just a mind, but that same fact about that same fact still applies here. It's way more than just thought, right? Because it's including all of the other components of Dasein's being, including attunement, including disposition, including the situated world, all those things, right? Anyway, the point is that all of those aspects that event has are missing from the abstract being character of anything at all, insofar as it is, right? We're not talking about anything at all, anything insofar as it is. This is, but what I'm trying to get at here is that it's meant to be a structural description of the categories of what appears, not even appears, what is, how Dasein experiences being, something like that. And he talks about this as that I think this is on the, where is it? Yes, beginning of 269. The human being must experience the utter unusualness of being over against all beings. It must be appropriated by it into the truth of being. The point of that is, it is a requirement to experience being appropriated, right? In order to see the thing he's talking about, you have to actually be able to experience being appropriated by in this case, being, in this case, meaning this truthiness business. And this truthiness business has this whole structure. It's not an abstract. It is and I say it's not an abstract for the Hegelians in the room, right? It is marked by uniqueness. It is marked by solitude. It is surrounded only by nothing. It is grasped in the clearing of the there, right? So again, this is why we're talking about a change in the understanding of truth. It's why later in other sections he'll talk about, if you make this particular mistake, then the sphere of representation will be broached, by which he means you will have you'll be submerged back in the sphere of representation, as opposed to being out of it in experience of being, Dasein experiencing being. What's the point of that? The point of that is that there is a tendency in previous philosophy to take everything that can happen and turn it into a representation, which occurs in a mind, because someone a long time ago decided that things don't occur anywhere except as mental events in minds, and therefore we start by thinking of everything that we can think about or represent in that form, and we've already made the metaphysical assumption that that's what it is, right? And he's getting away from that here, right? That always will have it be. It's as though that view of things views all of philosophy as a subset of empirical psychology, and that's exactly what he's getting away from here, right? Okay, so again, it's hard for people schooled in other traditions to hear all these things without the shift in perception, the shift in an outlook that it involves, and that's why he's going through this with some density, and he's contrasting it with metaphysical tradition, what he said in Being and Time, but he's also just trying to tell you directly, these are the moments that you have to see, these 8 facts in where is it, in 267, that you have to see about the being I'm talking about, the being he is talking about, if you're going to differentiate it from what previous traditions may have understood by being without the why. Okay, I'm going to pause there to give people a chance to react, have their questions, etc.
Just one reaction to what you've been saying. That's why I think in the other translation, they used "and owned" to translate their rightness, is to say, Dasein appropriates.
So
that's what's going on in being, is Dasein's appropriating.
So the point is that
And
there's a note, there's a note of being owned or owning in Eregnus in German, right? Yes. The difficulty with calling it owning is that it's not simply Dasein doing the owning. Owning, you have to think of owning as the act of making something own-like, the act of making something into the eigen of an eigenleak that owns. It's not that something which is already existing in the world has had ownership by you conferred on as opposed to ownership by somebody else. It's that you are becoming your own.
Right, that's the end part. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So again, this relates back to the eigenleak authenticity of Being in Time. This is in other places here in some of our reading, and also before in the Dasein sections, he talked about what it means to be a self, right? To be a self is to be capable of being owned in the sense of appropriated. Appropriated is, it's owned in this reflexive sense. You can become an owning thing. Yeah, having owning done to one, which is the same as decision to a uniqueness. And this is why this point about uniqueness is critical here. It's on 371, he says, this simplicity does not at all need to be set in relief and does not need differences, not even the difference from beings. For this difference is required only if being itself is branded a kind of being and is thus not at all preserved as unique, right? So there's a primary uniqueness in being, which, if I had to put it in terms of the representational view of the world, is something like the single worldliness of your life, right? You are not a class. You are not a possibility space, right? There is a single realization, right? That is the kind of uniqueness he is talking about. And that single realization is not just about you, right? It's an actual happening. Okay. He is relating all of this in the section on 267 to the other things he's talking about the establishment of the open region where of human beings and gods and world and earth, these different contrasts. But what's the point of this? The point of this is stewardness as a property that Dasein is acquiring, where stewardship means something like being the place or site where being appears or happens, where truth appears or happens, the truth of being appears. That is something that is assigned to Dasein by being, and that is part of the structure of event itself, right? So how does truth happen in the world? The answer is a Dasein is appropriated by being to be the site where the truth appears. Whenever truth actually happens, that's how it happens, right? And that is critical to the structure of event. Okay. I think that by trying to sketch out everything that he's saying about it at once, it can be hard to follow these essential differences. But I think even existential differences, I think that is an essential difference to understand. We will get to another one when we talk about the possible. This is on 374. Possible and actual are kind of flipping their meaning when you're going from the metaphysical view to this view, and it's important to notice this, right? He talks about this as without being experienced in this sense of decision of the unique, you do not experience possible as actually possible, right? This is 374, first full paragraph. The possible essentially occurs in being alone and as its deepest fissure. Okay. On the other hand, metaphysics makes the actual beings the point of departure. Okay. What is possible, and indeed the possible as such, opens itself only to an attempt. So the point of this is something like there is a future directed decision of resolving a real possibility of being that is involved in the full notion of possible. Possible is not an abstract possibility space. It's not the set of possible variables of an independent variable. That's not at all what possible means here. Possible means in a futurally oriented, thrown in time, transported existence, right? Subject of a decision, right? And withstanding possible is to experience possible that way. Something only rises to possible in that way if the thing which is at stake in that decision is being. What will be? what you will be even, right? That's the only thing that rises to the status of a view, pardon the expression, an actual possible, right? Okay. All the other possibles floating around are, representational frames of abstract, concepts in possibility space, none of which are concrete, real, historical, unique, world-liney. Josh?
I don't think it would hurt at this point to bring in a kind of a countersense here. Well, not a countersense, but when there's an emphasis on the unique, on the particular, on that which has never been, on difference, the question arises, and I mean, I know how I would answer it for Heidegger, but I'm wondering how you would respond. You need the other pole, which is how is any kind of understanding of the world possible if all you have is uniqueness and particularity? So that is to say, so how what do we point to in Heidegger's project here that makes possible interhuman understanding, scientific regularities, the very thing that allows us to function in an anticipatory way in relation to our world?
It's a fair question, but I mean, the underlying answer is lots of things, including the structures he's describing, which as structures have an order to them. But in addition to that, there's all kinds of things which the metaphysical way of revealing does have its truth, and these are ways in which truths are arrived at. It is not that the things which metaphysics are described as class character things does not exist. From Heidegger's point of view, the beyings are an attempt to preserve something. They're an attempt to preserve something experienced at the rock face of evolving being, something like that. But in that sense, they do not have the same, if we put it this way, immediate actuality sense that being does. And leave aside their utility, their truthiness is derivative in that respect. So he's not denying the existence of anything that science understands as classes. He's not just denying anything about the truths of technology as a mode of revealing of the actual relations between things as orderable objects, right? All of those things he's insisting upon as particular modes of revealing of particular things about the world. What he is always insisting, however, is that that's not the whole story, and it's missing something about the ordering of these things. The ordering of these things is that the underlying origin of both truth as a concept and truth as an experienced thing, something that actually happens, is not from the idea abstract universal character, right? That is a secondary construction. It's even the mission. It's the success of the mission of the first beginning that it has created. The elaborate structure of all of that, right? The first beginning set mankind on a mission to know the truths of nature as the reproducible, class-like aspects of truth, right? And that emphasis had its fruit, right? But something happened in the course of that, which is that because of the way it sets out, because of what has been constant over its length, and because its progression is to take the success of the later stages of that as the criteria for the revisions that it self undergoes, at the end of it, being has disappeared. At the end of it, even concern for truth has disappeared, and it's become a concern for manipulable relations for man's purposes, something like that. Truth has become a pragmatic matter of what you can do with things by the end of it, by the Nietzschean end of it. And he thinks that that is baked into the beginning of it, but so is the fact that the things that you can find have this class character. They want to be outside of time. They want to be universals. They want to be visible to everyone. All these kinds of characters. Dan?
Yeah. So very sorry for being like the time zone messed me again. It showed me 1, not none here.
Okay.
The uniqueness, and you mentioned that passage there with actual potential, and it reminded me, like, when reading that Tegmark and multiple universes, is like, it seems like they solved the issue, like they cannot live with uniqueness. They need to create potentiality. They need to collapse everything in something actual, and they came up with this idea of multiple universes. Pretty much at each point you create multiple actual universes are created, and we just stay in one of them, and something like that. But I think it relates to what Heidegger is saying there and what metaphysics is doing.
Right. I mean, so two things. The Max Tegmark possibility space view of reality, something like that, where it's a giant mathematical object that splits all the time. On the one hand, it's instead of just honestly saying that what we know from our science underspecifies the world, we claim that all the worlds that would fit within the truths of our science are the world, but we just don't know which one we're in. But this just shoves all of the explanatory problem off into explaining how experiencing consciousnesses navigate these world lines or fall down them, right? Which you can jump off into a measurement problem, or it can jump off into a collapse of the wave function problem. You can jump it off wherever it wants. But the reality is people experience not infinite multiverses of possibles. They experience, from what the standpoint of that representational understanding is single world lines through it. Why? They don't have an actual explanation for that, honestly. From the standpoint even just of a traditional science is better when it's parsimonious and doesn't claim more than it knows, the honest thing to do would be to say what we know underspecifies the world, right? Instead of saying what we know is that this giant possibility space is actual in all of its ramifications, and then the realization question is just not asked or not raised, or it's jumped it off for the empiricists. They'll tell us that once they eventually get around to telling us how consciousness works, right? Which they aren't going to do anytime soon. But anyway, so I agree with you that the representational world has a problem with possibility in that sense, and therefore with uniqueness, with concreteness in that sense. From Heidegger's point of view, this is part of the whole, he calls it the historiography project, the great plans of historiography in this section on history and historiography. What's the line? The line is that historiography flatters man that he can master in principle everything that exists. Where is this? Beings in calculation. No, even before then. Right, 388, third paragraph from the bottom. Historiology spreads the illusion that we can gain complete mastery over all reality, and does so by adhering to everything superficial and displacing the surface itself, which it takes as the only sufficient reality. Historiology as implying an unlimited knowledge of all things in all respects, with all the means of representation, as implying disposal of everything factual, leads to an exclusion from history. Where by history he means anything can have something actual, new, or a change in what happens to being. From his point of view, the one thing that historiology in that sense cannot anticipate or understand is any change in the frame of historiological representation, something like that. He says the ever greater compass of research is carried out a displacement of the genetic from that which undergoes the planning to the planning itself. When the planning and calculation becomes agentic, beings as a whole start to shrink. The point being that the research project, it's no longer that you're looking at an infinite universe. You now have an infinite research project to understand the infinite universe. Anyway, there's a point there about the totalizing illusion of representation, something like that, which is closed off from actual, it's closed off from mystery, it's closed off from free and undetermined, anything like that. Josh?
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you understand, use the phrase a change in historiological frame, and maybe
Sure.
connect that with how that would apply to something like, I mean, whenever somebody brings in physics,
You think of Kuhn.
what?
I can say you think of Kuhn, you think of scientific
Well,
revolutions?
I think of Kuhn, and I think of getting as far away from physics as possible, because that leads down to that precisely the wrong alley. And Heidegger throughout his career, especially in his later work in the seminars, the Zolikon seminars, focuses on a way of understanding, say, a change in frame that is not just about sort of a limit to knowledge, say empirical knowledge, that implies a kind of a cumulative notion in which, oh, you know, there's so much more, but that so much more is already being pre-understood within a certain sense. So yeah.
Sure.
I mean, yeah.
So and we can get to the section on historiography directly and what he critiques as its issues, but the fundamental point here is that okay, historiography wants to approach the fact that there is something like history by dealing with it in two ways. He describes it as the epistemological and the ontological. The epistemological is what is presently ascertainable about the past, right? So it's only the presently ascertainable, which is an epistemological frame. Only what we can know gets through, and the rest is just left as a to be discovered, but in principle, not completely like the stuff that we've already discovered. And then the ontological is that things actually change, but the way we understand that things actually changing is that we have a constant frame of reference, of representation, into which we place everything, and the thing changing is a slight wiggling around of the lines inside that representation, right? What never changes is the plane of that representation, which has a sorted place for every place and every time and every aspect of the understandable, whether it's in position or level of analysis or field of human understanding or endeavor, or spiritual nature of mankind, whatever. All of those things are just so many different sorted locations where a rather shallow descriptive content can be inserted to describe what is true at that time, in that place, in that aspect, right? That overall frame is meant to be large enough to contain all possible knowledge about anything that could ever have happened anywhere about anything. But that frame itself is based upon a notion of truth as representation and correspondence that is itself nowhere imagined to be subject to the same historical laws as the system that it is looking inside, right? Nowhere can that frame shift. Nowhere can the plane of time that you're projecting shift. Nowhere can the differentiation of the across the different fields of human endeavor shift, right? That is a fixed discovered fact that progress arrived at when it arrived at the historical sense, to speak Nietzsche, right, in sometime in the middle of the 19th century or something, and now understands that the realm of nature and the realm of history are two separate realms, but it has ticketed and sorted locations and representations for each and all of them, and that picture will never move. Is the historiography's totalizing claim. And from Heidegger's point of view, that is an attempt to eternalize a temporary intellectual understanding of things, something like that, which is itself a attempt to it is a challenging revealing that sets upon order sets in order, to use the language of the question concerning technology. It is that prior ticketing and sorting is the assault on what is that has already reduced it to order, something like that. anyway, that's what I'm calling the frame of historiography, right? And the from Heidegger's point of view, the point is that frame of historiography itself is a dependent creature of a particular understanding of truth and the role of philosophy from a particular era of Western human history, right? You know, you can locate when it arises. You can see what metaphysical assumptions it makes. You can see the idea of truth that's involved in it, right? And all of that was a mission to understand truth in a certain way that that humanity was sent upon by various investigated tasks set by the original beginning of philosophy, something like that, the metaphysical beginning of philosophy. So when he's talking about history in his sense, he's talking about the history of the revelation of the truth of being, something like that. And the history of the revelation of the truth of being is a terrain and an environment in which things like the formation I just described as the historiological frame are themselves momentary artifactual events. They're momentary, phases. They are pieces of its story, and they are being determined by active free decisions. They are not inside that frame. And in that regard, he has multiple comments about being about the unusual and denying. What's the thing? It denies every system that tries to contain it, something like that. Yeah, this is on page 375. Metaphysics, however, makes being something extent, makes it a being because it posits being qua idea as the goal of beings, and then, so to speak, appends culture onto this goal positing. But being is the refusal of all goals and the denial of every possibility of explanation. What's the claim there? The claim there is that being as an actual source of appropriating truth is going to go where it lists, so to speak, up to the free decisions of future thinkers and individuals as prompted by what being whispers to them, so to speak. And that is not going to be contained by a calculative predetermined frame, right? Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, Josh, but that's how I would.
Yeah, that was very satisfying. It's the idea that the future and the past are being determined on the basis of a preset, picture that's in the present. It's not allowing an actual past and an actual future to be,
Yes,
and
I will go further. I mean, the stuff at the very end of this section, I think there's an implicit contrast in a bunch of this with Nietzsche. I'm going to bring that out because in Nietzsche you get this idea of the how do I put it? A creative for human purposes disposing of these things, which is measureless in its ambition, so to speak. And at the very end, when he's talking about the in Dasein there lies a moderation, or even in the on bottom of 399, why must this decision be ventured? The freedom of the human being is abyssally thrust down. And this is the point that we were getting at with Pete about for what then is, then for the first time this question is impossible. For the moment the event of appropriation is the event. This moment is the time of being. What's the point of that? The point of that is at the point of a change in the, even the possible change of the essence of truth and meaning of being is going to dispose and human thought is going to listen. And there is in that a moderation about the undetermined future unknown. In the essay we're going to read for next time, this is also what he calls the background of the mystery. There is an unknowable freedom at the basis of being, something like that. And it is Dasein's moderation and what is fitting to know that, hear it, listen to it, not falsify it. It is a kind of, if I can put it this way, mental or philosophical or cultural imperialism of a certain kind to extend attempted systematizing understanding to the horizon in a way that is meant to eradicate the possibility of mystery and change. This is all covered also in this section 273 on history. This is the historiography stuff, or historiology stuff. Okay, so he says, what is meant by historiology? It is the explanation which establishes facts about the past out of the horizon of a calculated bustling about with the present. Beings are considered as orderable, producible, and establishable. He talks about eternalizing as a striving, which is a comment to this, of the dominance of this kind of historiography. It is a flight. Eternalizing is the not ridding itself of itself, as some objectively present, of a present that is far from history. In other words, eternalizing, staying with itself. The reason I mentioned the Nietzsche thing is Nietzsche talks about will to power as the will to eternalize a temporary power relation. And I think that is also being referenced here in this eternalizing. Historiology as its establishment is a constant comparing, the introduction of an other, wherein the human being is mirrored as one who has made progress, a comparing which thinks away from itself because it cannot cope with itself. What's the point of that? The point is that the summoning of the images of past and other places is always in a frame focused on the present, where the point of the contrast is to self-congratulatory, self-circling sort of manner, notice all the ways in which the present is triumphantly better than the other things to which it is comparing itself. And this is a way of reassuring oneself in a flight from oneself, psychologically speaking. And then after that, spreads the illusion of making a complete mastery of overall reality, disposal of everything factual, and he calls this exclusion from history. It's exclusion from history because it is denying the possibility of any openness to an actual future decision that would change anything. He also, on bottom of 389 in the calculation thing, he says, lived experiences reach the extremity of its essence, and lived experiences become the objects of lived experiences. That was already somewhat there in Nietzsche's use and abuse of history for life, talking about how the historian in his study, unable to live adventurously, reads about the adventures that people who are capable of living adventurously lived. But this has now been repeated second time as farce of the sharing lived experiences of people taking pictures of themselves, having an experience to share with others. And that what he calls the lostness in beings, a calculable whirl of empty self-circling. Right. So all of that is this. There's a lost totalizingness in historiographic representation frame. A lot of this stuff is also talked about extensively in questions concerning technology. I think that in terms of the downside things he's talking about here, all of this is very clear. But sorry, Dan?
Yeah, a quick question. So curious what you think. There, the first sentence that you read on 388, it ends up with the establishable idea. Is the Greek idea?
Yeah.
Is he?
Yes.
Is this going back to Plato? Is kind of going against him here? Like,
I think the establishable part is very thin in terms of tying it actually to Plato. In some of his other works where he talks about the establishable, he relates this actually to the Roman understanding of ratio. But the orderable, producible, establishable, the secured is the fundamental idea here, rather than an idea. But there is an element of the conceptual truth-seeking of idea, even especially of Aristotelian versions of it, that are an attempt to find the reliable, reproducible truths. You find a truth that is outside time so you can use it in other times, right? And that is what he's calling the establishable, right? There is something I can set up that I won't have to move again. This is Descartes trying to build on something that can never be revised as opposed to building on sand, right? So I think that is the fundamental idea here. But the producible is to we know only what we make notion that to be something produced according to a plan, and if not, the natural things are understood as being produced according to a plan of nature or God, but they're still thought of as producible. But over all of that, the things are orderable because they're permeated by a thought-like order, something like that.
But are all of this under the kind of the umbrella of the idea? Like, is the idea behind all of this that is kind of sustains them? And is that Plato and all his projects?
I think that idea is way more narrow than that. I think this thing he's describing here as historiography and elsewhere as technology and elsewhere as the calculable frame of representation is something that is being more and more established over the history of Western thought, but it's not simply there in Plato already as just the idea. I would even say that the idea notion is, the idea notion is relatively far from this. But is Heidegger trying to intimate that as soon as you have the idea, you're going to go down the whole rest of that road? He might be. I think there's lots of other branches along that road which are less than certain required, so to speak. Okay, but all of this is things which he is contrasting here with history or human being properly understood, or the way beings appear in the appropriate frame. And we've jumped ahead to a lot of the issues in the second half of our reading, where it's all about this is the contrasting views, this is the current views, this is where he's talking about the ways in which he is frustrated about the reception he can expect us to have, something like that. I want to shift back, if we can, to the place where he's actually discussing what he means by being. We got it a little bit of it with this event-like character and the uniqueness, and we talked about the what possibility really means. But he says other things about it where he's, think of it this way, using the language of traditional metaphysics, especially Plato's Parmenides, Parmenides' poems, where he says, being is, beings are not. This is something he directly says, and then he will revise that shortly afterwards. He'll say that the view of metaphysics is that the beings are, even the non-beings are, but in quotation square quotes, because they only are in a certain sense. That's a reference to the beyng of the sophist, and then the being is just understood as the highest of the beings, what is most eminently, right? And that's presented as the view of metaphysics. I put it to you, it's also the view of Plato, because it's highly reliant on what's in the sophist, but it's the Plato of the Parmenidean stranger of the sophist, rather than rest of Plato or Plato in general. And he's contrasting that with the thesis, being is, the beings are not. In what sense are the beings are not in that sort of Parmenidean frame? He will then say, by the way, that he doesn't think that Parmenides is quite at this understanding as he has it. But the claim here is to say that in the going to the plural, in going to the many, and in finding the being that they have only in this abstract and class member character, the being in the active sense has been factored out of them. That's the sense in which he's going to say that the beings are not. He will revise that to the beings are as his own understanding, but now in the same scare quotes that the Platonists reserved for the beyng, for the mere appearances or the fictions of the sophist, right? So there's a sense in which the beings are, but only in a borrowed way. They're not the standard of what is, but they are in a borrowed way as trying to preserve being itself. Only in that beyng-like sense are they. Compared to them, being is. That's the claim. And I put it to you that is an attempt to explain what what his own position is on this to someone trained in that level of Platonic or Parmenidean or Hegelian logic thinking, right? This is all on page 372. Right, that only being is and the beings are not. This is a first full paragraph at the start. With this knowledge of being, thinking first attains the trace of the other beginning in the transition from metaphysics. The position of metaphysics is that the beings are, non-beings also are, and being is the being that is most eminently. By the way, the position of the Platonists on that the beings also are, that a being less than beings is to them not a matter of course, but a conscious innovation of let's follow the way of mortals as laid out by Parmenides. Right, Parmenides gives the way of the gods in which only being is, the way of mortals in which to be and to not and not to be are the same and not the same, and the way of the altogether not. And Plato is deliberately taking the second of those. Sorry, Josh.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you think of the idea that another way of thinking about beings in terms of categories is in terms of using a temporal category to say that a being is that which persists self-identically over a period of time. So that's a temporal category of self-identity. And then I also wanted to throw in, maybe you could talk a little bit about why Heidegger at various points brings up that question, which I think originates with Leibniz. Why is there something rather than nothing?
Yeah.
And Heidegger,
That's what he calls, hang on. Too many things at once. That's what we call the transitional question. We'll get to it at the very end, the Leibniz question. But on this issue about the, is a being something which is self-identical through time, right? This gets at whether or not the beings are preservation. The first point that Heidegger is making here with this insistence that being is and beings are not, or at least if they are only in the quotes of the Mayon. The first thing he's getting at with that is that this unique actual experience as appropriation meaning character is, if you like, the truth sense of what it means to be, and not the note of persistence. The note of persistence is something afterwards, right? And only if that is maintained would you have it. This is why he says that he's constantly talking about the Greeks as attempting to understand being as enduring presence, but this is only from his point of view, it's a particular attempt to interpret / understand that is it's not the full underlying experienced essential occurrence character of being. The essential occurrence character of being is, if I go to it this way, something that time has at the actuality coalface, right? It's not an across time persistence character, right? If something has that actuality at the coalface character in a way that persists, that's some additional fact about it. But even something fleeting that has that actuality character is what has that character.
I think Heidegger is going further than that. For example, when he says calculative thinking, which is absolutely essential to the notion of self-persisting identity. In fact, you wouldn't have logic and mathematics without the notion of a self-persisting object. So he says calculative thinking is unable to foresee that everything calculable by calculation prior to the sum totals and products that it produces by calculation in each case is already a whole whose unity indeed belongs to the incalculable that withdraws itself and its uncanniness from the cause of calculation. So the way that I read this is that there is no self-identity. Self-identity over time is a misunderstanding or a naive understanding of that which is always slightly different at every moment. There is no such thing as there's no such thing as this.
He's not making the point that there's no such things as essential unities, because if you draw the outlines of the thing you require to be preserved narrowly enough, there will be one. What he's claiming is hang on, let me finish my sentence. What he is claiming is that across time class character is not where truth comes from. It's not how truth happens. right? So it's a derivative abstract fact, but yes, you can have derivative abstract facts that have that across time truth character. You can certainly create them, right? All you have to do is draw the membership requirements of them narrowly enough. He is not a Heraclitean Fluxus who's just trying to say you can't step into the same river twice. He's saying that the truth character is coming from the event character at the actuality face, if I can put it that way, which I realize is an abstraction for this, but it'll work for this purpose, right? You can still construct class truths about things, and calculation does. Those are not illusions, but they are looking away from the immediate truth character of the line of being, right? If you want to know where immediate truth character comes from, you have to look at the experienced appropriation line of being, is the claim.
Yeah, I think what we're doing, we have different readings of Heidegger. Mine is closer to Derrida, and I'll just read one more quote, which probably isn't going to make any difference, but I'll read it anyway.
Please. I don't want you reading on my stream. I don't want you reading my stream. You can give your own thoughts on my stream, but you're not going to read other people's thoughts into my stream. It's just not going to happen.
This is Heidegger's thoughts.
Which quote?
So
is it from a reading?
It might be. I'll have to look it up.
Okay.
It's probably around the same time. The same never coincides with. It's just three lines, for Christ's sake. The same never coincides with the equal, not even in the empty and different oneness of what is nearly identical. The same is the belonging together. What?
Okay. Dan.
So how about that statement there where it says being essentially occurs and beings are? He said we must declare. Is that like the transition statement? We are still in metaphysics, and from there when he says only being is, that's we're already in the second beginning?
He's giving the being, only being is the first way that it would be understood. And then he's recognizing that just as the meon has its own sense of being in the original beginning, there is a sense in which beings are in the other beginning, right? That's how I read that, right? He's starting with the strongest statement to make the contrast, and then he's giving a qualification to it that is meant to be parallel to the meon are at the end of the first paragraph 372, where he says non-beings also are, right, in quotes, but only are in that sense. And then that's where he says at the bottom of the next paragraph, and therefore in opposition to it, we must declare being essentially occurs and beings, quote, are, unquote. That same are that was used of non-beings in the original beginning is now being used of how beings are in the other beginning, right? So being essentially occurs, and the beings have this meon sense of are.
And this essentially occurs is pretty much what he says, this is the proper is.
Yes, the proper sense of is the essentially occurs that he is describing as being, right? He's trying to describe being with a Y, what he means by it, and essentially occurs is the fundamental statement about being is that being essentially occurs, right? And the beings do not essentially occur in that sense. The beings have their truthiness from their partial ability to preserve something about that essential occurrence, right? So, and he talked about this in Great Works of Art specifically, right? There's a sense in which being can capture something of being as essential occurrence. So, again, when you get to the section, not of how beings appear in the original beginning, but how beings appear in the other beginning, the essential thing about beings will be that they are something like a preserving of something about being. And this, by the way, will extend to Dasein and to language. So when we talk about steward of being, or house of being of language, or steward of being of Dasein, that is preserving something about being as essential occurrence, right? So the truthiness of essential occurrence at the coalface of actuality, so to speak, is something that can be captured in the projection understanding, self-understandings, and decision choices of Dasein, and can be spoken in language, right? And those are attempts to preserve in beings something about the essential occurrence of being. But the essential occurrence of being itself always withdraws. The essential occurrence of being itself has this character of it's always withdrawing. The beings remain in the foreground, but the being itself is a withdrawing, and it is this structure of this between where the confrontations happen, right? And that's where the actuality, if I put it that way, is occurring. It's happening as this structure between and this unfolding but that it never directly appears, so to speak. So appearance is a character of not only being, but not only beings rather, but beings in worlds even, right? So I agree that there's multiple voices that have to be tracked here to understand where he's going from description of the metaphysical understanding and his own. But it is noteworthy to me here that he is using the language of, put it this way, Parmenidean or Sophist era Plato theses about the being and the beings, the being of the one and the being of the many, right? To explain what he is trying to say here. On 373, if beings are not, then that means beings continue to belong to being as the preservation of its truth, and yet can never transfer themselves into the essential occurrence of being. So the point is that there is elements of the preservation of the truth of being in beings, but they are, when he says can never transfer themselves to the essential occurrence of being, they are never the standard of what is, right? You're never going to derive the standard of what is from those preservings. Okay. They belong to the truth of being, but they're excluded from the essential occurrence of being, he says. Right. So their truth of is not an equality operator. Truth of means revealing of. It means arising, appearing of. It means moving into unconcealment of. Whereas essential occurrence of being always has this character that includes uniqueness and withdrawal, and therefore does not have that character of only remaining in the arisen and appeared. And to me, the most challenging aspect of that is there's lots of philosophical traditions that want that, that having appeared truthiness to be a criteria of being. And he's exactly reversing that, right? The essential occurrence is the origin of anything like truth, but truth is an appearing of that. Okay. All right, so we got through the section on the beings is and are. There's he also talks about the contrast with nothing. Can you guys follow this? The way in which we understand being from the nothing. This is partly discussed in the question of uniqueness. Being cast around itself only nothingness, whose neighborhood remains the most genuine one and the most faithful guardian of the solitude. As constant of the solitude.
Page?
Sorry?
Well, what page are you on?
371, number 8. He's discussing uniqueness. But in the second clause of the sentence, in accord with which being cast around itself only nothingness. Okay. What does he mean by this? He means that you could imagine in Platonic conceptual terms, you can understand things by the perimeter or contrast around them, right? You could the essential content of this set is defined by something about its perimeter or what it distinguishes itself from. He's saying the only thing that being in this sense, an essential occurrence, is distinguished from is a surrounding nothing, right? It occurs or it doesn't, right? It actually happens. It's not distinguished from an around of some other character. The only thing surrounding this essential occurrence actuality character is nothing. And he will later even, this is the being and nothing distinction. And he will also say that that's what gives it its solitude. It's not defined by some other thing around it. It is defined by a nothing around it, that it is when it didn't have to be, if you want to be Kantian about it. Okay. And then he will later relate this to the notion of decision and possibility by calling this the venture against nothingness. That's the formula he uses. Being is the venture against nothingness. Venture is only missing an ad to be an adventure, but it is an undertaken decision in possibility, something like that, by a free. But this is on page 375. Free gives the metaphor of the banks that relate human and God, which we'll get to in a second. He says, in this way and above all in this way, being must remain inexplicable, the venture against nothingness which first owes its origin to being. So this is also where he's going to get to the point about refusal of goals and denial of possibility of explanation. There is an inexplicable originness out of nothing in this essentially occurring character of being, which he calls venture against nothingness. So the idea here is that there's something like a real contingent possibility that is actualized, that there is anything at all rather than nothing, right? And certainly that there is this rather than nothing. Okay, but it's not primarily the contrast with the this other than nothing that this essential occurring is happening. Okay.
So would it be fair to say that the reason there are beings is because this being with the Y is in between nothing and beings?
It does not say so. When we get to the part about why is there being at all, there won't be an explanation. It's groundless, right? It's the ground, whatever, something like that. But I think the critical point here is that the notion of being that is only surrounded by nothing, that is an essential occurrence only surrounded by nothing, is saying that there is this radical against nothing contingency. And contingency is not really the right word, because he's not saying it could be otherwise. He's saying it has this ventured decision-like character that being is, right? So I want to contrast this with something you might get in Parmenides. Parmenides says that the reason that you know that being is because it is a rational truth that, like the ontological proof, you can derive from the meaning of the concept or something. It has to be so. That is not what is being said here. He's not saying that that being is a requirement of logic and therefore is always true. Nothing like that. He's saying it has this this essential occurrence character that being is, right? The essential occurrence truthy character of a realized actual that did not have to be extends even to that there is being rather than nothing. This is where he's distinguishing himself from the Parmenidean. He on 372 says, but does not Parmenides say the same thing? No, for precisely here already, NA stands for beings. In other words, already has being as what is most eminently as the universal. The point he doesn't stress the point there that Parmenides is a rationalist who thinks that a rational requirement of logic has to be, and that's the highest form of truth, right? He's not stressing that that's what Parmenides is actually saying there, but it is. That is what Parmenides is actually saying there. Parmenides is someone for whom rational entailments of the concept, something like that, are a highest source of truth and a must be, that are setting standards of must. The Parmenidean poem is full of all of these needful and necessary and strong, language about these things, not just is. And you don't get anything like that notion of contingent truth in Parmenides that you're getting here. Okay.
Well, because Parmenides is talking about beings.
Parmenides is not simply talking about beings, because Parmenides is claiming that the way of gods is that being is, and the beings are not, and the way of mortals is that being and not being is the same and not the same. And from Parmenides' own point of view, that's because that being is a necessary truth, and all of the truths that people try to ascribe for beings are saturated with a conventional contingency of the structure of the concepts chosen for them, because they're reading be and not be as the same and not the same, that is class membership or a conceptual determination, is their standard of being. And for Heidegger, that is not for Heidegger. For Parmenides, that is not the standard of being. The standard of being is the necessity with which the logically entailed tautological being is true. So Parmenides does have a notion of a contingency of the truths of the beings. That's why he calls it the way of mortals and the way of opinion. But for the reason that arises for Parmenides is by a contrast with a logical rationalism, something like that, not a contrast with a separate empirical sense of being as essential occurrence, right? Okay. So besides the contrast with the nothing, the Parmenidean contrast, there's like 15 separate formulas for what being is, being with a Y. Some of these are related to the event-like character, the eight criteria, but he gives lots of others. The fundamental one on 381, essential occurrence names the mode in which being itself is, names being, right? But also things like it essentially occurs as the indigence of God and the stewardship of Dasein. Throughout this whole section, when he's giving his own positive statements, he's not just talking about event character in general or betweenness in general. He's specifically talking about the betweenness between gods and Dasein, where the particular relationship he's pointing to is the indigence of the gods. And what does the indigence of the gods means? It means that the gods need being, right? Which means they do not already possess it of themselves. The gods are lower than being in this whole scheme, very clearly. But the gods have a need of being. And their relation to Dasein is the steward of being. And Dasein, as steward of being, is the place or site where the appearing of truth of being can happen, is if we can put it this way, the only hope that the indigent gods have of being. If hope is the right word. For the gods which on their own aren't being and lack being, to arise and appear, it can only happen through the arising and appearing of being to Dasein. A way of putting this might be, only being can decide whether or not gods are, and that can only appear through Dasein's stewardship of being. Mankind cannot make the gods be, but being could, because being is this free, unconstrained origin point of actuality, something like that. And when he gets to but what of the gods on 399, he asks, why does this decision of the gods, why must this be ventured? And he says that this is to raise the necessity of being to the highest questionworthiness, and to set the freedom of the human being abyssally thrust down. And that does not mean cast down, it means placed as low in the structure of truth as possible, made as primordial as possible, made as basic as possible. Okay. So in that way, being is brought into the truth, the simplest intimacy of the appropriation. What then is, then for the first time, this question is impossible. Then for a moment, appropriation is the event, this moment is a time of being. This is the part that was difficult for Pete to grasp, and I don't blame him, right? But the continuation right after that is being is the indigence of the God, right? It's in the beginning of the next page, right? So the appropriating event is the place or site of the possible arising of anything like the gods, even in their indigence, even in their absence. When he's asked in other places, what evidence do we have that anything like this is possible? The only evidence that anything like this is possible is that Hölderlin had to say what he said. That's his evidence that this is possible. Okay. Why do I bring up all this stuff about the gods things? To me, the critical point that he's making with the gods stuff, besides the fact that there's this whole re-enchanting the world aspect of the whole project, of the contributions phase of the book, whatever, is to underline what is at stake in accepting anything like a radically free being that is the origin of truth, right? You cannot calculate that this or that is impossible if you accept that openness. Dan?
It's on that page there. I found what page is this? 381. It's a paragraph there. I think the fourth one, and it's a kind of a negative one. And he goes and tells us what is not, being is not. And he goes first. He says nothing in itself or for a subject. So to me, that's against Kant and all that tradition. And then he goes against beingness, and then he goes back to the Greeks. Physis, idea, and categories, and then he goes against the entire history of categories and says that's and something objectively present. But I found that to me very powerful statement there, that he says, telling us what being is not. Or
I understand. I mean, and the negative statements can be useful, especially for contrast with ways of thinking one is embedded in, so to speak. To me, the most poignant thing on this passage is that the rupture in between gathers towards the abyssal ground. What is this? This is saying something like that this openness structure is he's undoing the fissure, if I can put it that way. If the fissure is the splitting apart of being in Dasein, or Dasein in God's earthen world, but also being in Dasein, then bringing them back to gathering them back to what that structure encircles is putting back together the one that they fell out of, if you get me. So this is what he calls the between is a simple rupture that approaches being in beings. This meta-taxi notion, this notion of being as the between, that is the open articulation of all these things, that is trying to name more what it actually is rather than all the things that it is not, right? To the extent that there is something that it is in itself, the reason he's denying that it is in itself is because it is a opening of the sphere of a set of relata, right? Which is the opposite of an in itself, right? Relations aren't in themselves. Relations are betweens. They're betweens the things being related, right? And that is what is going on here, right? There's sometimes 2, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 or 6 things being related here, but the open of their relating is the thing which has this essential occurrence character, right? Now, I want to translate this slightly for Ella for a second into the language of Hegel, right? So in the language of Hegel, all this would be trying to talk about how the absolute subject unfolds, something like that. It would be, this is the place where dialectic would happen. But the difference is the dialectic is unconstrained. It is free. A formula for a German idealist of the Fichtean or Hegelian variety for what he is trying to say here is that being is the activity of the transcendental. Right? There's an unconstrained free in this relating at the base of what a Hegelian in the logic would describe as the like a necessary ground of being nothing and the dialectic between them, something like that. That's what you would get in Hegel's logic here. Hegel would give you a logic here that would relate these concepts to one another in a way that was meant to be definitive and provide a place for all distinctions, settle the question, put it to bed, right? And instead, he is insisting here on this open, undetermined future character of the ongoing event. Okay. I want to talk a little about the metaphors he uses here. He uses the metaphors of the bridge. He uses the metaphor of the river between 2 banks that is bringing the banks together, and he also uses the metaphor of the hearth fire. Being as the hearth fire. I note that the being as the hearth fire is harking back to Heraclitus, who also had that notion. People may not know, but it's also there's a whole bunch of stuff in anthropology that talks about the Indo-European understanding of the hearth fire as the way in which ancestors were understood. You can see all the stuff in the Fustas de Colons, the ancient city. There's a whole bunch of stuff about what the hearth fire meant, if you get me, anthropologically speaking, as well as philosophically speaking in Heraclitus. But the hearth fire as being as origin point of or abyssal freedom that has fallen apart into the structure of the ordered whole of world and earth and Dasein and gods. That is, it's Pindaresque, right? It's if that makes sense to people, like Pindar. Okay.
So Pindar writes odes to the Olympian champions and stuff. Or
he also talks about how love and strife between them.
Right,
I'm thinking of his. Yes, I'm thinking of all of his. All of his.
Hesiod.
I'm sorry, you're right. You're right. I'm thinking of Hesiod. You're right. I'm thinking of Hesiod rather than Pindar. Right. Yes, Hesiod. Thank you. The correction is welcome. Yeah, I mean it's at that level is what I'm trying to get at. Okay, he also calls this a reaching over gods. There's a way in which Dasein exceeds the gods. This is on 383, 384. Okay. What did anyone make of the reaching over the gods? It is reaching over the gods because the indigent gods lack being, and Dasein is the place or site where being appears. Dasein is being's favorite compared to the gods. The gods primarily need being. They only secondarily need Dasein. It's not clear that being needs Dasein. It is clear that the gods do. Okay. Okay, at 385, we get what beings in the new dispensations are, and this is all related to the Dasein stuff. Okay. Okay. Before we get back to we already covered the historiology stuff. We should cover at least a little bit of the discussion of human being. He wants this understanding of Dasein as steward of truth, something like that, to supersede previous understanding by of man as anthropologically understood. The human being, the one who has turned back in a self-casting loose. That was in the throne projection stuff we had in the previous session. I'm looking at 386, 387. Okay, and this is related to the issue of what it means for a human being to be historical. We talked about the historiographical thing he's contrasting it with, but what does historical mean? Historical means something like standing in the open unfolding event of truth and bearing with its contingency in a thrown manner, something like that, right? It's the part of steward of truth is a taking part in history as the activity of the transcendental, as the unfolding of dialectic, to be Hegelian about it, right? The universe in which man finds himself is going to change. It's going to change in uncalculable, unpredictable, uncontrolled ways. And bearing that possibility, bearing that contingency is what it means to live in history. To be part of the unfolding, revealing of the truth of being, right? In its contingency, in its uncontrolledness. That's why he also speaks about this as, unprotected, right? Standing in the unprotected, something like that.
Right, and I think here it's helpful to realize the German word is Geschick, which means also destiny.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just history as some story in the past.
Absolutely, it's future directed. It's living in history is playing your part in the ongoing venture, right? And that's why there is appropriated and appropriateness and ownness, right? It is an own thing to have a destiny in the ongoing history. It's part of being authentically that one has one's own there. Okay. There is a slight gloss on romanticism on 390 to 391, where basically he doesn't think that romanticism had a chance because it was stuck in the metaphysical understanding of being, right? But he is recognizing some of what it wanted to do in terms of bringing about a transfiguration that echoes his own project, I would say, and you find there in Holderlin, right? But the direction, the particular directions which it tried to do so, the resources with which it tried to do so, were hopeless, right? After seeking Goethe's intuition of nature, right, we turn earth and life into a theory, and then the wallowing in the irrational commences, right? So these are harsh words to say of most of Romanticism, but I put it to you, relatively fair words to say of most of Romanticism. So I'm going to try to extend them to him, as well as trying to popularize it in order to root it in the people or something like that. Now he does say of it, what lay fallow is again heated and sheltered and becomes a source of pleasure and edification. Pleasure and edification is a trivialization, but there's at least something which lay fallow, which is again heated and sheltered. Something new seems to rise up. Nevertheless, everything here moves in indecision. At bottom, because truth and source of truth is not in play in historical romanticism, it cannot reach the level at which these things actually can be decided or actually can change. That's the fundamental diagnosis here. So you can think of this as a critique of romanticism, which is saying it would have to be much deeper, as deep as me, to make any progress, right? I put it to you that it's not simply a repudiation of romanticism. It's also a potential rescue program. Go read Schelling with Heidegger's eyes, something like that. Go read Hölderlin with Heidegger's eyes. Okay. Talked a little about the language thing. I think that the critical thing there is, as talked about a little bit before, symbol being insufficient. In this section on the metaphysics of work of art, some of this is referring out to a much larger essay, which we won't try to get to. But if there's a key thought in the discussion of art, I would put it this way: unless something like what counts as truth is at stake in the piece of art, there's something fundamental trivial about it. Serious works of art engage our understanding of true. Okay. The transitional question toward the end in 400, he's raising this question, which he calls the transitional question. We already had the what are beings as guiding in metaphysics, turning into how does being essentially occur in the other beginning. But now he talks about the transitional question, which he's effectively situating between them, which is why are there beings at all and not rather nothing? And this is a question which was famously raised by Leibniz. It's Leibniz's formulation of principle of sufficient reason kind of questions. And it's also something you get used as the framing question of Introduction to Metaphysics, his own Introduction to Metaphysics book. But here he's calling that the transitional question. Why is it the transitional question? It's the transitional question because it is allowing something like why questions, not just what are the beings, which only gets at what can being mean in the standpoint of, from the standpoint of the beings, but now we're getting at something like recognizing there as being something contingent in the fact that beings are at all, that there are beings at all. So this is transitional because it's recognizing something of the essential occurring contingent character of being itself. I think that's why he's calling it transitional. It's not all the way to the how does being essentially occur of the other beginning, but it has heard this note of the contingency of being at all. There's definitely some things I want to get at in the last section, but I want to pull back for a second to the different things that were said about uncontrolled contingency and surrounded only by nothing and solitude and all that. And I need to point out for people who don't know these traditions, many of those kinds of considerations are ones that you could have found in Neoplatonic and theological traditions. There's a bit of his contingency of being an uncontrollable by calculation, which is a I am that I am of Exodus. There is a bit of this alone solitude and silence of being surrounded only by nothing that you would get in Dionysus the Areopagite and negative theology, and things that you cannot say about being because of its uniqueness, right? Anyway, it may seem like what he is saying here stands completely outside of traditions and is completely his own, but there are echoes of multiple other traditions there in what he is saying. Ella, question?
Yeah, this goes back to the previous paragraph on Leibniz.
Yes.
So for Leibniz, the windowless monads are merely mental representations. So is Heidegger pushing up against that and saying, hey, see, being is more than that. Being actually exists. Is that the whole point of bringing up Leibniz? Because he brings up Leibniz in the end of philosophy, the essay as well. He references Leibniz.
Yeah, I mean, Leibniz is the standard for the the precursor of German idealism in the early modern philosophy of the era of Descartes and Spinoza in German philosophy. He's also the teacher of Christian Wolff, predecessor of Kant, that Kant is reacting to, and his ontology is reacting to. So, just situationally, that's how he's being positioned here. But Heidegger sees in Leibniz someone from that era, sure, but also someone who saw back independently of that era to the scholastics and the Greeks to a degree, and who also anticipates some of the later developments of German idealism in a way. But from Heidegger's point of view, Leibniz is an idealist, right? He's someone for whom the monad picture is only a sub-picture. It's not the actual universe. Everything that is actually occurring is a thought in the mind of God, including the monads. And and there is a necessary existence of that mind in Leibniz. The ontological proof has not been overthrown at the time of Leibniz. But then Leibniz raises the question of why are there essence rather than nothing, and calls this the core question of metaphysics, and that can have a why question implies that there are answers seekable to it. And the two things that Leibniz himself is thinking of that in terms of is why God would make creation sort of goodness, something like that, on the one hand, and on the other hand, harking back to Aristotelian metaphysics of principle of sufficient reason, right? So principle of sufficient reason, nothing without a reason, is the typical formulation of it. And Leibniz tries to formulate the principle of sufficient reason in a way that goes together with his idealism and theism. And I don't know if I'm helping at all here, but to me, that's the context in which Heidegger is reading this particular problematic of Leibniz. It's not all of Leibniz. He has his other issues with the whole philosophical position of Leibniz. But the thing which he finds valuable in Leibniz is that Leibniz is raising the question of the contingency of beings. And that question is bigger than Leibniz's answer to it, if that helps.
Do you think there is, follow-up question on that? Thank you. Do you think on this contingency of being thought, Leibniz monads are similar in some way to, I don't know, Dasein or beyng?
They're similar to Dasein. I mean, they are what Leibniz has in place of having anything like Dasein or anything like Cartesian separate minds. But he wants them to be microcosmic in the sense that they are in relation to everything in the universe, everything in the whole, right? But the underlying motivation, this is taking us afield, but the underlying motivation for Leibniz in his own terms to have the monad idea is that he does not see how anything like mind or consciousness can be an emergent property of things that don't think, so to speak. So if you cannot create thinking out of things that do not think, then there must be thinking all the way down. So the fundamental constituent elements of the universe must be thinking things. That's the actual chain of reasoning that you get in the monadology, motivating primitive thinking things, so to speak. But again, that's just in his own self-understanding. And Heidegger is not referring to those issues of how does consciousness arise, anything like that, in his discussion of this thing. Heidegger has his own. He doesn't need a theory of monads when he has a theory of Dasein as a place or a site where the appearing of being happens. But Leibniz does, because Leibniz has to explain from his own point of view what is real and what is illusory in his, in his worldview. I don't know if that helps, but not all of Leibniz's problems are going to be ones that Heidegger is going to take over or translate. The raising of this question of the why are there essence rather than nothing is something that Leibniz thinks he's raising because he thinks that it is a fundamental philosophical question that Leibniz can determinately answer, and he is very interested in what those answers are. Heidegger does not buy Leibniz's answers to that question, but he thinks the question is bigger than those answers. Dan?
Thank you, Jason. Thank
Sure.
you.
Yeah, there is this section here with 279, but what of the gods?
Yes.
And it seems to me that he's going against, so he's kind of wary of religion, especially in this sense, and asking the question why, and he says it's trying to go that way, it's dangerous, and it goes back to, he says, this notion of production. And I think we read that book way back about production in Plato and
Yes.
so on, and it
Yes.
seems like why this why, and he said why being, this says out of itself, and then it goes with in between and abysmal knowledge and so on, but it's the why out of itself, and that's it.
So you're right that at the end of 400, right before he gets to the transitional question, he does gives this abyssal business. By the way, on the production thing, I think that some of this doesn't go back something to Plato. You're right that we did read a separate book about that from Rosen, but I think I relate this. I hear a duel with Nietzsche in this whole section, right? Nietzsche is famously the guy who says, "Could you create a god? Then do not talk to me about any gods." Right? I desire that your philosophical will to power legislation not reach beyond your creative will. And if you can't make a god, then you shouldn't talk to me about gods, right? So there is a what you can produce filter in Nietzsche over what should be philosophically taught, because he wants the cultural, intellectual, philosophical world that people of the future live in to be consciously their own creation, consciously a made human creation for human purposes. And that is part and parcel of his anti-theism, right? So the idea that these things that are being created are ideals or values or anything like that, and that you should not create those, you should not posit those things if you cannot create them, if they're not producible, is, I think, being referenced here. So Heidegger is disagreeing with Nietzsche's only human creation's ambition. And I tie this into to what we get at the bottom of 401, where he's talking about there lies in Dasein moderation. Nietzsche is someone who exceeds that moderation. Nietzsche is someone who dispenses with gods because he can't make them, right? And wants to live in a world only of the made, and wants future mankind to live in a world where the city extends to the horizon, if you get me. The city meaning the made world of human construction. And what I read this section here on the indigenous of the god, etc., why the gods. First, he wants to push the point of human connection to truth low enough that it goes below that discussion, that contingency, right? You're not in a freely contingent future truth if that question is something that you're going to rule out as, no, that wouldn't give me a humanly controllable world, right? So, okay. And the point of this is to leave to the appropriate event the whether as well as the why. Okay. And then reasons, ground, and origin of the why, in each case beyond beings. I have a comment I'm going to make about page 400 and page 401 from my own perspective in a second. But first, reading this compared to Nietzsche, right? Okay, being essentially occurs why being out of itself. There's going to be an ungrounded ground here, but he does not want that ungrounded ground to be a human creation for human purposes. He doesn't want it to be a projection in that sense, right? Okay. So I agree with, sorry, go ahead.
Just to say, like, to me, it seems like this question of why goes in the direction of production. Like it's kind of, it's going that way when we ask that question, and we get us in all kind of trouble down the road. But that's my reading.
I mean, partly. I mean, certainly, if you answered a why question from the standpoint of a human purpose, that would be true. There is certainly okay. There is a tendency in Heidegger to equate anything like good with both production and with value. Value is the Nietzschean version of it, and value is always relative to man's purposes. Values are produced, and they are produced for the sake of governing man's conduct. They have a connection, pardon me, an essential connection to viewing something like poetic philosophy as governing mankind, as chiseling the block of marble into what it should be, something like that. And yes, that's an element of production. And values viewed that way are instrumental and are part and parcel of this power productive view of truth in principle. And he is definitely moving away from those things here. But he is also, how to put this? By 401, he's going to tell you that there is a holding to the measure and a moderation needed in this stewardship of being. Stewardship of being is not the same thing as Superman exalted to Lord of the Earth, right? It is a definite move in the direction of moderation. And it is a definite move in the direction of open to future contingency, open to, yeah. And he says in the very end of our book, right? This is about holding to a measure which first posits measures. These measures come from what's fitting, right? So this is there in language, but it's also there in this language and silence. Language and silence are he's relating these things to the event. But what's the underlying point here? The underlying point here is that in this Dasein relating to being as steward of relating to truth, as steward of the truth of being, is it is appealing to and hearing a moderate and fitting coming from being itself, something like that. Okay. And by the way, on 400, he also said all of these reasons and grounds and ground and origins of the why, in each case beyond beings. There needs to be something beyond beings to answer those questions of why. And there is something like a measure or fitting that is moderate coming from service to the truth itself. I'm going to wrap up what I meant by all that in just a second, but Dan, you have to let you interject for a second.
Another thought. At some point I was struck in this section somewhere above. He says Nietzsche's rebellion, and you also says that you want to tie up with this Nietzsche. And is he referring that Nietzsche like step outside this moderation? Like
yes.
It's
yes.
Because he ends the book on this tone that it needs to stay on moderation, and Nietzsche's rebellion.
He's saying,
too far.
Nietzsche is a kind of rebellion against truth, right? Truth in Being in Time, not Being in Time, in Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche is famously asking, truth, what is it good for? That sort of thing. And what in us really wants truth, and what if untruth is a condition of life, and all those sorts of things. There's a rebellion against truth in Nietzsche that is also a rebellion against the moderation of serving truth as opposed to ruling it. That is also a rebellion against there being uncontrolled or mystery that is not humanly conquered in the world, and in the extending of the city to the horizon. Those are all part of the challenging revealing that ends up being technology to Heidegger, right? Nietzsche is the subjectively self-conscious interior view of a technological world to Heidegger, right? Where truth has been made instrumental to power, right? And Heidegger does think that Nietzsche does not foresee all the ways in which that view is going to have self-undermining properties to a degree, right? But he's also relating all this to what Nietzsche understood by nihilism versus what Heidegger understands by nihilism. For him, Heidegger, nihilism is nothing happening to being. And that is something that Nietzsche himself is issuing in. Okay, but I'm trying to relate all this to the fact that answers to why questions always point beyond beings, and that there's this notion of a fitting moderation and measure stemming from being itself, or the language of being itself, or especially the experience of relation to truth as stewardship of truth. Okay. I put it to you that all of these are a kind of residual Platonism in Heidegger, of which you may not be conscious. That you have to have something beyond beings. That is precisely the reasoning that led to the positioning of the good beyond being in Plato and the Neoplatonists. This notion of the measure stemming from silence that sets the appropriate. Again, this is exactly the role that good as measure has in Plato and the Neoplatonists, right? Heidegger tends to view Plato as way more productionist and already Nietzschean than he might be. And he also tends to view all of these things about good in terms of the later distortion of them into value, right? But he has his own versions of them, and those versions come out as propriety, being a self, appropriate, measure, moderation. All of those things are recognizably a Platonic good governing relation to the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? So to someone who is looking for ways to eradicate every last vestige of Platonism, this may be a criticism of Heidegger. I do not have those tendencies, and to me, they are not a criticism of Heidegger. They're an attractive thing about him, that he has not extirpated these things, but that they remain in him. From my point of view, part of that is just the fact that if anyone is relating to truth as their standard, some of those things are going to insert themselves automatically. Right, Dan?
Yeah, I agree with you that he's kind of, to me, like Heidegger is kind of following in the footsteps of Plato, except ideas. He kind of tries to go to take that down as beingness, as metaphysics, but the rest he more or less he keeps it the same.
He doesn't like the abstraction element of ideas, and he thinks that the ideas are way too focused on the mental, if you can put it that way. But honestly, I think he assimilates Plato to Aristotle enormously, and some of these things are very true of an Aristotle and less true of a Plato, because the ideas to Plato are not simply subjective plans of things used for human purposes existing only in minds, right? They're exactly an attempt to understand a between that lets being and minds communicate. Ideas are Plato's version of a between, right? And Heidegger doesn't need that because he has his own version of the between in this, the open of being, but that you need something like a between to explain veridical truth. How does a finite mind in time know timeless truths, was Plato's question. Heidegger is worried that if you're looking for truths that are timeless, you're not going to find the most interesting, important ones, right? So I get that that's going to shift his view off of idea. His notion of ideas comes fundamentally from Husserl, right? That's where he gets his notion of what that is. And the idea is read off the nature of things, but as projections of the mind, right? That's how Husserl understood them. And that's way more Aristotelian than Platonic, right? For Plato, the ideas are not produced They exist independently of the minds. They are between the patterns and things in the minds. But anyway, this is all very far afield on Plato. I think so many of Heidegger's criticisms of Plato on these issues of how abstract his notion of truth tends to make things are just, and I think him positioning himself as being on the pole of a Parmenidean, a father Parmenides, as opposed to someone who's taking the way of mortals, in which he's going to get mired in the sphere of doxography with his truths about the individual beings that he thinks of as more necessary than they actually are. Many of those criticisms are just, but there are still things about this where Heidegger comes out on this fundamental openness to truth implies a moderation and a receiving of what is fitting from what is not man and not from human purposes, but from the nature of things. That is, to me, core Plato, right? But other people may think other things are core Plato. Okay. I've gotten through the things I wanted to talk about the reading, but we also just finished the book, right? And we need to talk about what we make about the book as a whole, right? Pete mentioned its fugue-like nature, right? Beginning of our whole last section, he calls it, blocks hewn from the limestone to make the construction that he eventually wants to make, right? So it's an unfinished arch. I should mention one other thing from our reading before we get onto this, that he mentioned several times the metaphor, the bridge between things. You have to realize that part of this is this is a little bit of a joke, but it's an attempt to reconstruct pontifical man, right? The maker of the bridge between mortals and gods. That's what pontifical meant. What's our overall assessment of the book? I mean, we're very far from being in time. In being in time, there's a lot of things which can be read as just philosophical anthropology contributions. The things he's trying to convince you of in being in time have a far greater evidence than the things he's trying to convince you of here. They may not be as far-reaching. They may not be as transformative for philosophy or Western history or something like that, but they are far more evident on their face, if I can put it that way. In being in time, he's staying closer to the stuff he knows he can convince most of the audience of. Here, he is soaring far away from that. This is more like where he would want to go if you were willing to go the whole 9 yards with him, right? So that's a fundamental contrast between early Heidegger and the Heidegger unpublished Heidegger of this stage. But besides those gross assessments, what do we think of the project he's engaged in here, of its worthiness, of how much he has succeeded in accomplishing it? Is it a vision which is compelling as the future or next thing that philosophy has to do? Overall assessments, not of Heidegger generally, but of this book and what it managed to say or accomplish. Dan, you want to go first, or you want to Pete go first? Dan's ready to go first.
Sure, I will take a shot, and it's interesting. I'm also rereading his ponderings, and it's kind of the first one, and it's interesting how this project is coming for Heidegger. Now, rereading that and rereading this, and it's kind of he published Being in Time. He was completely misunderstood. He was frustrated that he said that the real problem with that, there is not a real adversary. So he expected some kind of dialogue, and then he kind of decides it's his failure with whatever his political involvement, and then he goes back, he retreats again in solitude, and he decides to oppose that book himself and take it further. So takes whatever mistakes he made in Being in Time, he decides to overtake them here. And of course, I'm not saying it's a perfect book or whatever, but it's kind of going in unexpected directions and opening new stuff that I don't think other books are doing that. And to me, that's amazing, like going with him there and seeing in what direction he goes and how far he goes and what kind of issues he puts the entire question, like so many deep questions. To me, that's amazing. And it's probably in a way it's a failed project. It's not going to happen the way he wanted, but he questions everything, and to me that's enough.
It's certainly ambitious, and I agree it's extremely impressive. I also noticed, though, you mentioned frustration, and I can feel the frustration in this book, right? The frustration about the reception of being in time, the frustration about the need for some of this, the animosity sometimes unleashed towards historiography or anything like that as foil, right? There is definite. He says that the fundamental disposition of this new attempt is a kind of diffidence or restraint. But his criticisms of the world around him are not always that restrained, right? I mean, it's frustration is evident there as well as part of the disposition. I agree with that. I don't know that's just about the reception of being in time. I think being in time made more weight. Well, part of what's going to happen if you convince a lot of people of something is that they're going to understand it very differently because there's a lot of them, and they're not going to understand it all the same way. But I think his biggest disappointment was that people did not see the level of ambition about truth involved in it. They tried to minimize how much it was aiming to do in order to accept the pieces from it that they liked, and to immunize themselves against upsetting anything about their existing ways of thinking too much with the further reaches of it, so to speak. And to me, this is so much more in that direction. If you thought the things which you didn't buy about being in time were unsettlingly innovative, right? Hold my beer, right? But Pete?
Yeah, so I guess so one thing referring to being in time, it's incomplete.
Sure.
So, he gets division 1, he does the phenomenology, and that's a good introduction for his audience. And division 2 is kind of rushed, and then he never gets to do the history of being that he promised when he outlined the book. But we do get the hints of being with a Y, because he does mention the clearing. Yeah, right in the introduction, he has the 3-part thing about what is being asked about, what is being questioned. You can see where already has a lot of this stuff, what he's talking about here, it's in his mind already. He's already worked out he hasn't named being with a Y yet. He doesn't have a word for it. I think you can also see it in the division of existentiel and existential, between what applies to specific Dasein and what applies to being in general. And in this book, this is the one where he explains Sein with a Y. He's named it, he's got his name for it now. And he's talking about it directly. I think, one just overall criticism of Heidegger is he just has trouble just explaining what he's trying to say clearly, I think.
It's because it's all work to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and in 100 years, when the encyclopedia articles explain Heidegger, they'll get it down to 1,000 words or whatever, and people will then go back and read these books and say, yeah, that's what was going on, but it was just really hard for him to get it out.
Yeah, I think if they get it down to 1,000 words, I don't trust the article to have captured it at all. But I get you. You're absolutely right that he is. they're difficult thoughts, but he also can present them very obscurely and in a very challenging manner. And there's a reason why it is a difficult task to interpret Heidegger, and while there's legitimate room for disagreement, competing explanations, etc. of things, for sure. But I want to get more specifically though to the stuff in this book, the project in this book, because it's not just that I'm going to explain, being with a Y to you. There's a whole, that's section 8, right? There's a whole sections 1 to 7, which is a whole, laying out this grand arc project through, the contrast with the original beginning and the idea of another one and the unsettling and resonating and all that kind of stuff, and the transition via leap into Dasein as a new form of human being that overturns all previous metaphysics, something like that, as well as future ones and last gods and meanings of beings and all of it, right? And
Yeah,
there's no getting around how ambitious that structure is, right?
Right, and so this is where he lays out a lot of that. You can kind of get hints of that a few years earlier in the introduction to metaphysics, because he's going back to the Greeks.
I mean, introduction to metaphysics is honestly just trying to say, here are things you can learn from the history of metaphysics, but here is what is unsettled, unthought, and left, or problematic in the whole history of metaphysics, something like that. But it's entirely possible to read that as mostly, history of philosophy, and less programmatic than this. This is way more programmatic and future directed. Go ahead.
But now, once you read this, then you can see it's not like when he wrote this, he suddenly thought all this stuff up.
Oh no, I get that. I get that.
And that he fleshed out more of what he sees in the other beginning. If we go back to the pre-Socratics,
in earlier stuff, you could easily think that what he's going to do in any other beginning is going to be some revisiting of history that's going to, find more correct things in the pre-Socratics, or is going to correct a few mistakes along the way, or something like that. And what we're getting here is not just a critique of metaphysics and critique of philosophy hitherto, nor even just the direct philosophical anthropology sort of contributions of being in time basic problems, right? Instead, we're getting the project of an entire other beginning of philosophy. And that is all of the elements that were directed critically towards the formation of metaphysics were absolutely already there, and were already clearly out and being discussed. And but from being a critical historian of the history of philosophy to being the projector of another beginning in this direction, those are two different things, right? The first is way more academic activity than this is, if you get me.
Right, but now you can go back and flesh out.
Sure.
Also, like a lot of I've been reading what he says about Aristotle in the 20s.
Sure.
And you can also, in retrospect, go see what he was actually saying, besides reading Aristotle in a different way than the tradition.
Sure. I get that. I get that there are elements of his actual, future vision which are sprinkled through his criticisms, but there is a drastic difference in imprint and history in the world and ambition between someone who claims to understand and critique the history of philosophy and someone who projects the next stage that philosophy should go that will refound the West on a new basis. The latter is a much more programmatic philosopher, almost prophet-like role compared to the brilliant historian of philosophy, he's going to tell you all the places where Aristotle missed something, right? Which Heidegger could easily have been taken to be up until then, right? He didn't want to be taken that way. He wanted these programmatic challenges he was issuing to be seen and heard. And whenever he's, noticing something that Kant didn't notice, he doesn't want that to be, just a little criticism of Kant. He wants that to shake worlds and knock down pillars and, overturn formations, right? And if people aren't reading it that way or aren't hearing it that way, then, he's got he's a bigger drum to beat, right? So this is definitely a bigger drum, but he's not publishing it. But I guess I'm asking for a reaction to that grand project side of it.
Yeah, well, so now, seeing what his grand project is, great. I'm understanding what Heidegger thinks it is, but in terms of what's the next step now that you've worked all this out, is the answer just, Gelassenheit? And we've grasped this, we can't willfully do anything, so we just wait.
Sure. I understand, but he's obviously not just talking about just waiting. He has whole research programs and programmatic things that need to be done, and language needs to be understood this way, and romanticism needs to be understood that way, and there's investigations into all of these different philosophical topics that need to be done in this new program, blah, 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 right? That's not just waiting, but it is philosophizing, not, it's not storming any brother breaches.
Just a small point from what you said, I don't, more and more, I don't see him as just pointing out where the past, they didn't go far enough.
Right.
I see it, he's pointing out where they were right, but then that part was missed by the next people.
Sure.
And maybe not so much Plato at this point still in the 30s, but certainly with Aristotle, he seems to be saying that Aristotle understood a lot more than the tradition, got going through the Neoplatonists and
sure,
the Islam.
And this is especially, aletheia, recovering aletheia or phusis or any of those. Obviously they saw, or the early Greek thinking book, obviously they saw tons more than the, typical doxographers get out of them, right? And
right,
there are continents there, absolutely. I mean, and as a deepener of the tradition, few people can hold a candle to what Heidegger has done to re-deepen the tradition, and all credit for that, absolutely.
And that to me, at this point in my reading of philosophy, is really the exciting thing. With Heidegger, now that he's worked out, explained the Seyn with a Y, I think I get it, and it's brilliant, but it works against, Kant's wrong, Hegel's wrong, Nietzsche's wrong. But great, in 2025, what are we gonna do with this? That I haven't figured out where to go with it.
Fair enough, but I put it to you that means that this vision of this arc of this 7 steps is not so obvious a structure or so compelling a research program that the next 20 things to do clearly trip off the top of the head.
So now I'm ready for a poet to come along to come up with, okay, I'll go, yes, that's it, finally.
Yes.
This is what Heidegger was waiting for.
I think
but
he wished that people saw it already in Holderlin, but I don't think they're going to find it there. I mean, you guys are separately reading Holderlin. You can tell me if you found it there, but I don't think it is.
yeah, yeah, that's not my favorite part of Heidegger. I see it more. There's more of a. If I was German, maybe the Holderlin
Speak to
would
you more.
speak
Yeah,
more to me.
I got it. Sorry, Jason, hand up.
Yeah, this idea about the poet helping us. I mean, we do see poets helping us, giving us ways to communicate.
Absolutely.
We have changed the way we communicate about various things. And although he's talking about Holderlin, he was talking about the German people when he did mention Holderlin, what their destiny is.
Mhm.
And I think that the argument still applies. I mean, we do see poets even today, they do speak very clearly about important matters for us. It's just a matter of listening to them.
Sure. I mean, poets, art in general. I would even say that for the how to put this, in the section here, which is smaller than the other things on the origin of the work of art, but the section here on art, he basically makes the case that unless a work of art is engaging you on the level of truth of being, relationship between gods and men, between earth and world, if it's stirring that level of your thinking, that level of your being, then it's great art, something like that. And I think that is true of some art today. I think less perhaps than some of the past. I think music does that more these days, but that includes the poetry aspects of music than a lot of the other arts, unfortunately. But certainly art can have that role. The point though about why he stressed Holderlin is to him not just a German romantic poet who speaks to the German people. He is the would-be prophet of the possible return of the gods. Right. That's the reason that he cites him as important. He's the person who raised the possibility of mankind re-experiencing what the gods meant to the ancients in a modern way, right? In a way that is informed by German idealism and lets them appreciate the spiritual nature of what the Greeks of the ancients understood that way, and what that issues in the forms of belief or anything like that is an entirely separate question. It's can that be recaptured, reappreciated, was Holderlin's thing. That at least not the only thing in Holderlin. I'm just saying it's the thing in Holderlin that Heidegger latches onto and claims is the reason why he is important for something like a next step in philosophy. So it's not just anything that poets can tell us. It's specifically this possibility of a reopening of an experience of the spiritual, of the divine, of the being meaningful, of truth. That's the thing that he's getting at, and that he's looking for some successors to do. But that can't be a matter of just poets inspiring. It has to be a matter of, at some point, also philosophers understanding and encapsulating. Dan?
Yeah, if I can say, so there is this, we are kind of like now at the end of modernity, we are stuck in this, like the God is dead, the end of history, there is the liberalism one and so on, there is this progress all over. And we see this kind of like this new trends in religion, politics, and so on. And you see, if you go a little bit on conservatism, like anti-liberalism and so on, and if you go deeper a little bit, you find Heidegger there, and especially with something like this, even if we like it or not. And it's so strange to me, like they like we are kind of, it's this kind of movement against end of history and liberalism and so on. And even in like something like strange, like the war there in Ukraine, there is actually a guy who's like that Dugin guy who's kind of a big fan of this book, and he and it's, to me, it's very interesting. Again, even if you don't like it or not, it's Heidegger is there, and people took this second beginning in especially new ways, especially in politics and religion and so on.
So I agree with that. I want to get to Ella in just a second, but first, just on that, I mean, you're right that those things are there. There's lots of people who look in philosophy and movements in philosophy only for this fact about it, that it's a point of sovereignty, it's a point of uncontrollability, it's a point of freedom, it's a point that can move things. And there are some people who are interested in that, not for the actual content, but for that fact about it, that there's something uncontrolled in it, there's something sovereign in it, there's something resisting in it. And when someone wants to use those facts about philosophy or even a particular movement in philosophy for their own purposes, no matter what philosophy they are using in that manner, they're behaving in a Nietzschean power political manner. And there's a significant amount of that going on. So, I mean, I agree with you that there are, if we put it this way, more genuine and less manipulated tendencies and movements inspired by this, or that you can find this under in the modern world. There are also relatively cynical attempts to just use it as a argument that has not been answered that can be employed as battering ram. But anyway, that's my own take on some of those attempts to operationalize Heidegger for contemporary politics, if you get me. We can come back to that if you have a thought on it, but I'm going to get to Ella first. Ella?
Yeah, I'd have to agree because I have noticed that, but yeah, I had a different point. Because I'm interested still, regardless of that, and because he does, as Dan pointed out, raise so many questions, and I like the questions that he raises, and also,
I just jump in for a second and be very clear. None of that to me is any criticism of Heidegger or taking Heidegger seriously. It's just there's certain people that use him superficially.
No.
I'm only talking about that. Yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's my point as well.
Yeah.
It's nothing to do with Heidegger. And Pete's point was really good, because once you're in that clearing, you've removed all of the metaphysical layers that impede you from knowing and feeling the truth, right? And Dasein, and there you are, what's left. So, but you answered that. There's more for me to learn, obviously. I've only had 3 sessions, but I liked when, Jason, when you mentioned that thought of maybe we should reread Schelling with a Heideggerian lens. That's pretty cool. I mean, I mean, maybe we should, because Schelling has that, for some reason, that connection to nature. That,
yeah, I mean, that's the place where he's bringing up. He's talking about, can we go back to Goethe's intuition of nature, or is that going to just get us into some silly irrationalism? And I think of that, there are some elements in, not just in German Romanticism, but in German Romanticism and German idealism at their cross, of which Schelling is probably the leading example, that we're trying to get at something like this transfiguration idea. And I don't think that they had the philosophy for it. I think that the philosophy that they threw at it was not going to be able to come out with the results they were seeking there. They were too early, if you get me. But I would think that there are things to be gleaned from reading Schelling with post Heidegger glasses.
Yeah, and I am continuing to read Schelling, but and then the other person I would read with Heidegger glasses in order to have this new vision of philosophy might be Alfred North Whitehead, but I'm sure that's not going to be very popular because he has the Einsteinian viewpoint, because he's a contemporary with Heidegger. Right.
Certainly, lots of people have noticed that the process focused cross points. Some of that stuff was just simply in the air. But I think for most people who are taking Heidegger seriously, Whitehead is still too much on the positive pole of things, if I can put it that way. I don't know if that's entirely just to Whitehead. It's just a common assessment of him. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think if we read some of these like Schelling for nature, Whitehead for the science and the the updated science and mathematics. Any other great, Plato maybe,
Sure.
should we even go there? But I guess we can, right?
Absolutely.
And take into account Heidegger's perspective.
Yeah,
and not-
absolutely. And there are people certainly attempting to do that. There's others that are that want to run further in what they take to be the direction that Heidegger was going, as well as how to put it, traditions of their own that are influenced by him or by things that he learned. And I'm thinking of the postmodernists and so forth. There's plenty of traditions in the modern world that are heavily indebted to Heidegger on this stuff. But to me, the extra idea there is the things which he himself called out as, it looks to me like there's something here, but it needs to be refigured. And the leading ones to me are the pre-Socratics and Plato and the Neoplatonists, right? Are leading examples of that. But Schelling is certainly another one. Whitehead might be, I don't know. Just don't know him well enough. I've read him a little bit, but you know. Anyway, it is a perfectly fine research program, and the beyond that, there's the issues he's pointed to, unsettled issues he's pointed to, independent of revisiting particular historical people. So I think I didn't want to turn this all into our assessments of Heidegger generally. It can do that after a big book like this. That's fine, but I have a general reaction to some of this. There are things about the call for a more serious attachment to service to the truth in this book that I find extremely attractive. There are things about it which are, a kind of yearning for a depth of spiritual understanding that I find very attractive. There's also tones of impatience, frustration, occasionally resentments that are less attractive. There's occasional places where figures in the tradition are treated less than charitably. There's weird places where people that he has very strong criticisms of are taken very seriously, and people he has great debts to aren't given their due. Right? There's little, but those are minor. They're minor compared to that overarching point. In terms of the contributions to the history of philosophy, and its critique, I think they're outstanding. There's a separate issue though, which is the one I was trying to raise by contrasting being in time with this, which is that the being in time basic problems of phenomenology thing are going to push people from wide traditions in directions where they're going to see some of the limitations of their existing ways of thinking about things, and that's going to move them independently of buying into everything Heidegger is saying to revise and improve what they think. Then there's the grand project for the future ones as a enlightened Gnostic group that is going to spread the wisdom of this new way of thinking. And I think that that's, if that is an expectation of a reception, it's naive and it's not going to happen. There is going to be some tendency in that direction for some people. But I think most people are going to take out of this project the possibility of doing the like in its endpoint rather than actually adopting it and stepping through it. Right? I don't expect something like this. I mean, expect is the wrong word, but we're sufficiently long into its publication, we can know some of these things. I don't expect this to create a school of thought of those who are committed to teaching the leap as something that all of their students should take by the end of the semester, right? It's not that kind of it's not going to have that kind of I don't know if success is even the right word. It's not going to have that kind of leveling width, if we don't want to call it success, right? It will remain a rare venture for rare thinking. That's my own assessment of this book specifically. It's pitched at a level, and it's it's the level of, I'll put it this way, the rhetoric of this book is all invitation. It's all that this is something that could be done. I've done it. You could, follow me along this path, and some people will want to explore that path. But it's all, there's no compulsion. It's all invitation, which is attractive in its own right. But it also means that the set of people that are going to walk along it is going to be extremely limited. Right? We just have to recognize that fact. But anyway, that's just. I think that it is true this whole area of thinkers have the attitude that the thought that is carefully attention to questions of truth and that tries to deal with the weightiest questions will have an impact in the long run, kind of irregardless of anything about its immediate reception. And I think that that's true. It's because the influence mostly happens through future great minds that are touched by it. And that, I think, will be the way in which this has impact, right? It's not how many people read it. It's the smartest 10 people who read it over the next 300 years, right? Something like that. Anyway, that was just wanting to give you my own assessments of the book, what I make of it. I do find it poetic and moving at times. I find there are, some things in it which are a bit harder to take, but overall, I find the focus on the event-like character of truth perfectly sensible. I do think that there's an element in it where he downplays a little bit the importance of anything like the eternal. I gotta say, he thinks of it almost as a swear word, and I don't. I do notice that this is almost an aside, but when he has a little section at the end there where he's talking about the Greeks and Doxa and the Greeks and the Agon and the Greeks, and at the very end of it, he starts talking a little bit about AEI, which is the the Greek word for the eternal or timeless. And he doesn't go and launch into a big analysis about how it has an A privative attached to a being word. But he could, he just doesn't. It's not his problem, right? The way that the Greeks at the first beginning experienced the idea of the eternal is not something he has investigated, but he could. Anyway, but I'm getting at the fact that I see particular, it's not even blindnesses. He has his own direction of thought that he's going to go down, and there are certain things he's not going to see, that he's going to leave behind him unthought. I especially like noticing the ways in which I can see echoes of the way in which earlier philosophical traditions that he might be otherwise dismissive of actually survive in his way of thinking about things. He's very good at finding structures, and the structures that he lays out are compelling as these things we ought to notice about the things which are more general than the thought of a particular thinker. And I notice things like needing to find something like an appropriate, apt, called for, moderate even, at the base of anything like a dedication to truth for its own sake, that I think is a structure. If we get to this basic questions things where he talks about the experience of wonder as the fundamental orientation of the first beginning, we might talk a little bit about that. Anyway, I'm rambling now, but I'm just trying to give you a little bit of my own assessments of this book and some of the things I definitely do like about it. It's challenging. I enjoy the challenging aspect of it, but I know that it can be off-putting for a lot of people. It's the kind of, I do find that this is the kind of book that I had to read 3 times before I got it. So if you've only read it once with a little bit of help and didn't get all of it, do not be surprised. That's par or better. Pete, sorry.
They just go through the fugues again.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
And it's a couple things. One is with Holderlin. I think Holderlin might have been the closest to hinting at the other beginning.
Mm-hmm.
More, with Hegel, Parmenides and Heraclitus are kind of frozen, and even with Nietzsche, and Holderlin might be the one that pointed Heidegger in the direction of the other beginning. And with this book, so this is the one where really Erignus, he opens a kimono on the importance of event
Mhm.
for defining the structure of the field of meaningfulness.
Mhm.
And another thing in this book is we see the beginnings of the development of criticism of technology
Mhm.
that's going to end in 10 years with the question concerning technology. We get machination and stuff, and
Yep.
he's already moving and preparing that criticism.
Yeah, I would say also a lot of the things he says about historiography in the section we just read already prefigure a lot of this stuff as well. Yeah, but you're right. The machination stuff in the first and second chapter very much on point.
Maybe one other thing that mentioned Hegel, he's kind of like the anti-owl of Minerva that only rises up after history at dusk.
Yes.
He's like flapping his wings crazily here, and nobody's paying attention.
Yeah, there's some other fun things about the metaphors he does with light there, but he mentions the pretending to understand in the artificial light when we should watch over the night, right? So what does watch over the night mean? Watch over the night, if you don't know, means that you should pull an all-nighter, staying up all night, quietly meditating, and even when it's completely dark, right, is the idea. So despite the metaphors of the hearth fire, and the question of, will the embers of being go out, right? You can be staying up the whole night. I'm thinking of your owl of Minerva, right? He wants to stay up the whole night, watch over the night, even if there isn't any fire burning, right? And that's better than pretending that we already understand because our little dim self-created light pretends to be the actual real hearth fire. Anyway, as I said, he can be poetic. I like his metaphors on this, but compared to Hegel, the thing that is attractive here is that, I mean, to be blunt about it, Hegel is pompous. Hegel is pretending to have figured out everything in a system, and of which a Kierkegaard could just look at it and point and laugh and say, if that's the absolute, it ain't much of an absolute. And Heidegger does not have that problem. Heidegger is not. He may be overly ambitious here at times, but he doesn't end on a note of boasting. He ends on a note of moderation and a note of what has to be left open as the mystery that we don't know, that is sober by comparison.
Maybe in that regard, I don't know if you've read Pippin's latest book on the culmination.
I have not.
And he's like on totally Heidegger,
Huh.
and he
Okay.
thinks Heidegger really puts Hegel in his box.
That's entirely believable. Send me a link. I'll definitely be interested in looking at that. For those who don't know, Pippin is a famous scholar of Hegel. But if he's coming out that Heidegger had his number and understood him, it would be news, because it would be a prominent Hegel scholar agreeing with.
So it's called The Culmination. If you just
Okay.
Google Pippin culmination, you'll
Yeah,
find it.
I definitely look for it. Thanks. It's a good recommendation. All right, I want to give people a chance for final comments before I want to close on what we're going to be doing next time. Sorry, I'm just typing culmination into my search bar. Found it. Heidegger, German Idealism, and the Fate of Philosophy. It looks great. All right, I'll get it. I had like only if I had not like even a full class, but a few, I mean, not like a full semester class, but a few classes or lectures with Pippin when he was at the University of Chicago for a while visiting. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, one more thing, now that you mentioned Hegel and the system, I think what I also like about Heidegger is this kind of like his entire life, he worked on the same question and he worked it over and over again. And he never claimed that he arrived at the end or something like that. For him, questioning and staying there in Dasein and asking question, and the fact that being there is abyssal or whatever, it's without, so it's not a closed project, it's an open project for him. And he doesn't claim like he reached the end. It's kind of, again, inviting us to join and do our own thing. It's kind of an opening of it's a path. I think the motto of this book, it's or what we says, it's a way or whatever. It's not final. It's an opening. It's an invitation, and do your own thing. Here it's what I'm doing, but you can do your own thing, and it's not ending. Like Hegel said, this is the end, this is the final, this is the absolute. And all big philosophers pretty much said that. While Heidegger say no, it's not ending with me.
Hegel is particularly egregious on this point, and there's lots of other philosophers that try to leave at least something open. But I agree with you that Heidegger is very inviting about this, and very inviting in that he's calling on people to think and to engage with themselves and so forth. I also like the disposition focus that you get in Heidegger. That it's not simply he does not treat philosophy as though it is a matter of having the right arguments to arrive at the right opinions in order to be at the right position in a doxography or accept a system or something like that, right? These are all about much more focused on the this way, almost self-transformative things one does oneself, and what it means for dispositions, what it means for basic attitude towards things, what you come to understand is actually true, right? There's all this, that is all to me way more how to put it, it's psychologically attractive, it's psychologically compelling, it's personally compelling, it's spiritually compelling compared to as a way of engaging with truth and ideas and thoughts and culture than the somewhat conceited notion that if I just master these arguments that I'm going to know the truth for all time to lay down to others, right? It's yeah, anyway, on the same point on that one. I've ordered that book, Pete, so you know.
I think you'll enjoy it.
Sounds good. All right, anyone else have some comments on the book or stuff before I recapitulate what we're going to do for next time? Take that as a no. So next time, unless people object, is going to be the 22nd of December. And we're going to be reading the essay on the essence of truth from Basic Writings. Pete, you say you have a PDF of this from the other book?
Yeah, it circulates, and it's also in Pathmarks, and there's a PDF of Pathmarks.
Great. So, I mean, maybe if we can just arrange to put a link in somewhere. I mean, I would do recommend if people don't have this book and they're interested in other things, it might be useful to have, because we're probably going to do some other things from it at some point in the future. But if it's only a 25-page essay, and if someone doesn't want to, get the book for that, we can probably provide a way of getting it in PDF form.
I can probably. I think I have a bunch of the pages from it already, and I can just add the rest of them. And then I can add a comment to the meetup.
Sounds great. That'd be great. That'd be great. Okay. And then just to explain, I mean, because it's a short essay, we're just going to read the whole thing. The early sections of it will recapitulate some of the material we've done before and some of the other essence of truth things about truth as correspondence and that sort of stuff. So you can go through those relatively quickly, although if it's new for you, you may find it useful. Aletheia is something to look at there, original meaning and as opposed to correspondence meaning. And then the later parts of the essay are where it gets more interesting. He's going to relate truth to freedom, errancy, and the mystery. So those are the terms I want you to pay attention to. The 4 terms. Aletheia as Greek understanding of truth and what its original meaning might be. Freedom, errancy, and the mystery. And it's just a relatively contained essay. It's got some serious meat at the end of it. The very last section, section 9, will also talk about the truth of essence as opposed to the essence of truth, as a little bit of reversal. But anyway, we'll just read all that for next time. And this is meant to be a relatively fun, not too challenging. I mean, individually sections of it can be challenging, but not too challenging in terms of the amount to read and so forth before the holidays. And then the idea is, if people want to look at it for getting the book fashions, that in the new year, we're going to get this to show basic questions of philosophy. This is contemporaneous with contributions. I think it was like a 38 lecture course. It covers some of the essence of truth topics again, but it also goes into the basic disposition of the first beginning. So you get this long explanation of wonder as the basic disposition of the first beginning. And I think Dana mentioned this before, something to potentially do. I want to do it now because I think with contributions, at least for some of us under the belt, this is going to be much more comprehensible, but it's also maybe a good entry to some of the themes of contributions for those for whom that was challenging. That's likely going to take 3 or 4 sessions in the new year. We'll probably do about 50 pages at a time. It'll only be 4 if we want to do the appendices, which has some things in small type of the earlier drafts of it. If not, we can probably do it in 3. But I wanted to mention that so that if people want to take some time to get the book ahead of time, if they don't already have it, they'll have some lead time. And the idea would be that would be sometime in January, and we'll settle the time on the 22nd. Anyway, that's our plans on things to do next. As always, you can send me email or messages on Meetup if there's other things that you want to put potentially in the queue for future things to work on. And thanks everyone for taking part today. All right.
Thanks everyone.
Yep. Okay. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Happy holidays.
Thanks, you too.